So, Berto, there's a new Beatles documentary called Get Back on Disney Plus that just came out.
Get out.
Put together by Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame. Mm-hmm. And I thought we would watch it and nerd out on Beatles dumb, and also maybe talk a little bit about the psychology of the Beatles, and also just in general what it's like to be in a band. What do you say?
Yeah, what is it, an hour and a half? You want to watch it right before we record?
It's 8 hours long. It's an 8-hour-long documentary. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I make guanábana-flavored water.
So whenever we do an episode on the Beatles, I always feel like we're going to attract some people who don't really know us, and I also feel, and therefore feel compelled to justify my Beatles cred. In a nutshell, I grew up with the Beatles being on the radio in the 70s. And then when I turned, I don't know, like 13 years old-ish, I got my hands on a best of Beatles album, the orange one, the red one, the first one.
The red one, okay.
Yeah. And Love Me Do, Please Please Me. And I'm 13 years old, and instantly I was like, this is the best music I've ever heard. And I would sit on my bed with my wooden tennis racket that I never used. It was just like given to me by an uncle or something. And I would pretend that I was Paul McCartney. And I could kind of pick, before I was a musician, really, I could sort of hear the voices. I started to figure out, because there would be documentaries. So there was enough information where I was starting to get to know the voices and who was who and who was playing what. So that was when it began. And then it really flourished throughout high school, where I, started getting all the albums and super into it. And I've told this before on the podcast that my entire bedroom, every inch was covered in only Beatles stuff. I didn't have,
oh my God.
I didn't have, U2 posters.
What age?
16. I didn't have a Lamborghini on my wall. I did have a Captain Kirk life-size poster on my door. But aside from that, it was all Beatles, and it was covered, the ceiling, the walls, and there were big posters and postcards and records little trinkets that it was like a museum to the Beatles, and I was obsessed, and I had all these little moments, the first time I heard the White Album. And because, back then you couldn't go on YouTube or Spotify. It's like you had to get your hands on these albums. And
it's such a discovery to go through that.
Yeah. And as I started to write music in high school, I would say 50% or more, 75% of my inspiration was the entire Beatles and solo career of each Beatle, their catalog, because I was buying up all those records as well. And then not only the music, of course, but what they stood for and their relationships with each other and their stardom and their charm and the way they moved, the way that Paul McCartney kind of flips his hair in 1964, it still kind of gets me, and reading about their lives and all this stuff. And so when it came to this documentary that was shot in 1969, early 1969, I had a very limited understanding of it because they would only show little clips in these documentaries. But anyway, my point is that when I, pre-watching this documentary, I'm just going to say I've got to be like, I don't know where I stand. I will differentiate me from super fandom in that I don't know like every tiny little detail. I know a lot of details, but I don't know every tiny little detail about their lives the way that some people do. You essentially call them like Beatles scholars, essentially. And those, they're out there. And if you're one of those people listening right now, there might be a bit of frustration because we might not go into that because we're just not.
Yeah, or we might get stuff wrong.
Little details.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would and I've repeatedly said throughout my life that the Beatles are my favorite band. I've never changed that since I was 13 years old. Whenever anyone asks who I would want to talk to, if I could talk to someone or hang out with someone, I'm pretty sure it was always Paul McCartney for a variety of reasons, musician-wise and all sorts of reasons. I don't have any illusion to believe that Paul McCartney is a likable person in life. Like, there's reasons to believe that I actually might not like him if I really hung out with him a lot. I don't know. So I'm not one of those like Paul McCartney fans.
You guys would be BFFs?
Well, no, I'm just saying that he might kind of annoy me. Like I'm just saying like I'm not one of those apologists of Paul McCartney. Who knows? But I will. I do consider him to be the most important musician and artist in my life. You know, there's just so many different things about what he did, and also John Lennon almost equally as well. And so I'm a super fan. Berto, give us your creds.
Yeah, I mean, so I came into this in a couple ways. My cousin Diego, amazing organist. He had a Yamaha organ that was, two decks, they call them, I guess, and the pedals. And that guy was awesome. He would just entertain so well on that thing. And he could play everything. He'd play like sambas and salsas and then gringo music, like all over the place. So he taught me my very first song on a piano, in this case an organ, ever in my life. And it was Let It Be. Also, he had the Blue and the Red, both, albums. So whenever I would go over to my cousin's house, and he was older than me, so I looked up to him. I was in Beatles heaven, and that's all he had. He only had those 2 albums. So I didn't actually, growing up, I unfortunately didn't have each one of the albums, when I was a kid. But I had that, and that was plenty of examples of the great music.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's got to be like 25 to 30 songs.
Yeah, and then the fact that my first song I ever learned to play was Let It Be, right? That forms a strong connection. Yeah. Another thing that happened is...
So you learned it on organ, not piano.
Well, yeah, although I didn't... Oh, actually, no, it was... Yes, in fact, it was both hands on 2 different keyboards, because he taught me how to do... So it wasn't exactly the piano part. He taught me the chording on the left hand and the melody, the main melody of the piano on the right hand. But I was also doing the pedals, I remember. So it was kind of a different arrangement. And then the other thing that happened is we took a trip when I was 14 years old.
So when you hear that song, does it take you back?
Oh, let me take you back. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And at 14 years old, I took a trip from Bogota to Manizales. Manizales is a small city in the coffee region of Colombia. And it was with my cousin, and including this cousin that I'm mentioning, Diego. And it's an 8-hour drive. Like, this is a long, and it's, talk about long and winding roads. These are scary, winding hill roads where you can fall off and, 8 hours. And on that ride, we had a couple tapes, and one of them was like this Beatles tape that had a lot of their early songs. It wasn't like an official tape. It was, someone had made it, And so it had a set of different songs. I don't remember all of them, but I know for a fact it had some of the very early ones, like Love Me Do, and it had All My Loving, things like that. And we listened to that over and over and over those 8 hours. So that also stayed in my mind. Then I moved to this country when I was 15, and my first real friends that I made were all into music. And a couple of them...
Well, wait, so were you a super fan in Bogota?
I was a super fan as in, I knew who the Beatles were. I admired those 2 albums.
So you weren't a super fan back then. You were a fan. But
I was a fan. I didn't know enough about them because, other than, like I said, I knew those 2 albums. I knew my song.
I think super fandom it would be in this metric defined by when you had all the albums.
Right. Except I wasn't there yet.
Okay.
And then I moved here, and Shun, my Japanese friend, he was very big into the Beatles, and then that was something we had in common. We would talk about it, and he actually had, I don't know if he had all the albums, but he had several of the albums when he was in high school. So I started borrowing, and then I think I finally started buying my own, and then I started reading books and biographies and all the stories.
Okay, now you're getting into.
Now I got into. There was a time, probably in 1993, 94. Where I knew so much lore about the Beatles that I'd forgotten all of it. But I knew so much
that
I was
late high school?
I was first year of college, first and second year. I was insufferable, I am sure. Anyone who got around me, I would be like, blah, 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 Beatles, blah, 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 blah. And it was fun because I would find these biographies and it'd talk about some of them were very serious about the music. Some of them were very catty about the relationships. Some of them were all about the story with their manager and Brian Epstein and stuff. And some of them were more about their early days. Some
and
of
you're
them
a
were
musician.
More later days.
You're a musician at this point.
I'm in a band. We're playing covers. We're playing Beatles covers.
Okay.
So that's when I was really. Oh, and by the way, I was in the music theory program at UW.
Yeah.
So all the stars aligned, and I was super fan.
You weren't a music major.
I was a music minor. The reason I wasn't a major is because you had to do a practical instrument, and I didn't want to do that.
Yeah. Did you know I was a minor as well of music?
We've talked about it, yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know you were.
Well, but you actually were in the choir?
No.
Oh, you were in a jazz choir in high school?
High school, yeah.
Yeah. So I would have had to like take up piano or take some instrument and do that.
And I didn't want to like.
I think you and I had the same thought.
In terms of what a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington in music, what it would give you, I wasn't really interested in that life.
Well, because I wasn't looking for a degree to like go do something with it.
Right.
The degree was incidental in that I wanted to take those classes.
Right.
Wanted to take theory. I took the year training. So, I learned a ton, but it was certainly not, I wasn't looking to do more with that.
I didn't learn much. I took classes I learned things, but nothing practical, I would say. Like I even took a class on composition thinking I would learn about composition, but it was so, I don't know, it was so oriented towards classical that it just didn't really resonate with me at all. And I don't think the professor really it was just a class of like 5 people. Imagine that, University of Washington, 5 people sitting around a piano, and I'm the only like non-major. I'm the random dude who just took the class, and
so I did 3 years of theory and 2 years of ear training.
3 straight years of theory.
3 straight.
So you weren't just a minor, like you.
Well,
the reason beyond.
Yeah, I had more credits, but the reason you can't get a major without the practical, you just can't.
Right.
They won't give you one.
Yeah.
So
because I think I took probably like, I don't know, out of how many quarters do we have in a full degree? Is that 3, so 12?
Yeah.
I took 2 full quarters of music classes.
Okay. Yeah, I took 3 full years of theory, 2 years of ear training.
Anyway.
And it was
so fun. You're a Beatles fan. So, we're into it.
Yeah.
And so let me give a summary of what we're talking about here. Is Let It Be, if you're not familiar, people out there, was originally the Beatles in 1969, so they're well past their floppy, love me do days, floppy hair, love me do days. They're kind of past their psychedelia phase, but maybe the public doesn't really know that yet. And
by the way, I wrote this down as the very first thing that I wrote here. I basically had such a warped sense, not just about this documentary, like before this, always about the timing of all their life events.
Right.
In my head.
Well, we're going to get there. So,
okay, we'll get there. But yes,
the
like,
timeline.
This is past all that.
Yeah, the timeline is so interesting because I had a similar, but I think I resolved it earlier, a long time ago. But anyway, so this is early 1969, and this is post Sgt. Pepper's, post White Album, post Magical Mystery Tour, post Yellow Submarine, and they want to work on a live show because they're not doing live shows anymore.
And by the way, this is part of it. They hadn't had a single, in 5 months.
Yeah. I don't even know if it's that long, honestly.
That's what they said on the thing. It's
okay.
It's been 5 months since we had Hey Jude. Hey Jude. How do they say it? Hey Jude. I forget how they pronounce it.
What do you mean?
Jude. Hey Jude.
What are you talking about?
Like, because of their Liverpool accent.
I'm trying to figure out what you're talking about.
Hey Jude. Well, it's like more pronounced or something.
Oh, okay.
Hey Jude.
Well, they wouldn't get rid of the J. Let's just put it that way. You're like, how they say in Liverpool, hey Jude.
Hey Jude. No, it's the opposite. It's more like, hey Jude. But anyways, my point is that it's 5 months and they're talking about it like, dude, we haven't had a hit for 5 months.
We're getting that. So this... they decide that they want to do a live performance, and they don't want to do an actual live performance because they've given up on that years ago because live performing for them was very difficult because of all the screaming fans and the lack of security and almost being killed in the Philippines and stuff. And so they feel beholden to the fans to provide something, some kind of live. And maybe a lot of bands were like this back then, but there was this expectation of constant. You could almost consider them almost like YouTubers, like this expectation to constantly provide content. Today Radiohead will put out an album every 5 years or something, and no one like hates them.
Right.
It's just like, look, it's Radiohead. But back then, when you were a band, it was just like you not only had to do the albums, but the singles and the live performances and the interviews and the tours. Tours. Like it was this you had to be, because there's no internet. So in order for you to be relevant or in their lives, you had to be physically in their town, like interfacing face to face with these individuals. Anyway, so they wanted to do a TV live performance, and what it sounds like that they did is they're like, well, if we're gonna film a live performance on TV and broadcast it, why don't we do a little build up to that where we film us writing and arranging these songs, and then it'll culminate in this live performance on TV. Well,
and by the way, it feels like this was mostly, but not entirely, but mostly Paul's inclination.
Totally, absolutely. It certainly wasn't George's.
No.
And so as they're doing it, as they're recording, as they're working on their songs, it's starting to not be so fun, and they're starting to have some tension. So they change it over time into a feature documentary rather than a live performance on TV. They record several days, something like 60 hours of footage of the band writing and recording, and they release it as a documentary in the theaters, and it actually won an Academy Award for Best Original Song Score. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Which makes total sense, because it's like, what was it up against in 1969? Then at some point, and Berto, maybe you know the detail on this, the people who have control over this thing, they pulled it back and never like re-released it. It was never on VHS tape. It was never on TV. Like, it was fine and I think it was just an hour and a half. They condensed it down severely. It was this very, very short little thing compared to what footage they had. And then at some point, I think Paul McCartney.
Yeah, I think so. Paul never felt good about it.
Yeah.
He didn't like the Let It Be album result.
Yeah.
He didn't like the whole thing. So
he didn't maybe like the way he looked because George was yelling at him and stuff. And
maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah. But so I don't know exactly, but it does seem, what I remember is that Apple Corp, basically Paul said, yeah, let's
pull it back. Yeah, so it became, by the time you and I started knowing about it, you couldn't watch it. It was like unavailable to us, which even during the VHS days was kind of weird.
I don't know, like, how did I watch this somehow?
Well, they had bootlegs.
Okay, so because I remember in college with my friends, with Dave and Shun, like we watched it somehow.
So there were bootlegs, and they weren't official, like you couldn't go to the Blockbuster and get one, like.
In fact, I felt like we got it at Scarecrow, maybe. I don't know if they would have carried bootlegs. Well,
by then you're in the 90s, so I don't know if that's different. But anyway, so I've as a Beatles nerd on YouTube over the past 10 years, there'll be little clips, and there'll be people analyzing a lot of the footage that is in this documentary that came out last week on Disney Plus. I've already seen a lot of the beats that because I don't know how people got their hands on it, but they would pour over. There's certain YouTube channels, like there's this one YouTube channel called Pop Goes the 60s, and he's this really well-spoken Beatles scholar, and he'll like go over these things, and he's very level-headed when it comes to this sort of stuff. But anyway, so then,
I specifically remember that line, the George line, like, I'll play whatever you want me to play. I won't play if you don't want me to play. Because at the time, Dave, Shun, and I would always have band arguments. And so I remember us watching that and being like, you see, it happened to them too. And Dave's joke was like, yeah, see, they had fights too, but they were already huge at that point. We're not anything.
Yeah. So then Peter Jackson comes along, of Lord of the Rings director fame, and he is a huge Beatles nerd, and takes it upon himself to get all the footage, put all of his efforts to making this a viewable movie again, and he released it well, then it was going to be released as a 2-hour documentary in the theaters, but then COVID happened. So Peter Jackson went back into the studio and said, you know what? I want to kind of make my cut. Like, I made a cut for the theaters, but now that it's not going to be released, let's just make it my cut. And incidentally, they used machine learning to isolate the conversations, because, you know, a lot of the conversations are happening when someone's noodling on a guitar or something. Yep. And so they use computers to get rid of the guitars and insert essentially like conversation bits, you know, like an S would be omitted by a guitar, and so they would have to insert the S, you know,
which is
I mean?
why sometimes the visuals are not matching the
right.
They also, my understanding is they also upsampled. I think they also used some ML on it for like the visuals, because like the original footage was, which is still amazing to me that grainy 16 millimeter footage can still have so much content that you can, you know, make a digital version. Yeah,
they clearly touched up a lot of the frames to make it more readable, so to speak. And apparently, you know, didn't invent things, you know, they you know, they're just trying to sift through the noise to actually get, because a lot of the conversations, the interesting ones that happened during the filming of this, were the Beatles and others thought it was kind of behind the scenes. They didn't really think that this was going to be included, because they're just having a private little conversation off to the side. So anyway, it's about to be released, and it's produced by Ringo and Paul. And there's all these naysayers, apparently. You know, they're saying, oh, it's Disney. They're going to clean it up. They're not going to, because there's a lot of dirt that happens. And Paul is in charge of it. So, you know, he's going to make it himself look good.
He's going to look great.
And they're going to whitewash it. And, you know, everyone understands that, you know, Paul was the a-hole, and that George and John were victims of Paul's weirdness. And, you know, why do you think that narrative developed?
Which, by the way, in my opinion, maybe I have the wrong sense of this, that developed later, like in the 2000s, because in the 90s, everything I heard, or at least everything I was reading, whatever, was how it was all about John and Yoko.
Well, so there were two narratives that developed right away. One was, it was all about not only John and Yoko, but Yoko.
Well,
Yoko,
sure.
It wasn't. It was Yoko's fault. That was essentially the
but
blame.
You know, like the extension was that John didn't stop it. He was mesmerized by it. And,
right. You're right. But the thing is that in the 70s in the United States, the dominant narrative was Yoko broke up the Beatles. But the other narrative, like a second narrative to that, was especially about this Get Back, Let It Be documentary footage, was that Paul was dominant and being annoying, you know, and that he was the one, and then he was acting like he was trying to keep everything together, and then he snuck off and made his own album and released it before everyone else because he's a conniving little prick, you know what I mean? That was definitely a narrative. But
I wonder if like that was a narrative that missed me early because I was not the right age, and then when I was getting super into them, like because I remember, like, again, this was in the 90s, like mostly I only heard and knew about how terrible Yoko was.
So why do you think, because watching this and knowing everything else that we do, reading all the other biographies, why would that be the only thing that people walk away with? Yoko, it's all Yoko's fault.
There was some amount of racism.
Yeah.
I also think there was some weirdness to it. I mean, undeniably, she can be annoying. Like in the movie when she's screaming, I'm like, could do less of that.
So I want to go into that after you answer this question, because I got a lot to say about that, actually, if we're going to be on that topic.
Well, all I'm saying is, I think that Yoko didn't do herself any favors in that regard, because she was a bit eccentric, and the influences she had musically as they started appearing, many people, including myself, didn't really appreciate it. So it was an easy target. And then the fact is that after they broke up, John went on to write many songs about Yoko. And so one could mentally put dots together and be like, oh, yeah, that must be it.
Yeah.
Yoko was the cause.
Yeah. I would also say that obviously sexism, and also everyone wants a villain. You know,
Yeah,
it's just easier to blame someone. And then if it's not Yoko, then it must be Paul. And the gestalt that I have from this documentary, which I always knew, but Get Back by Peter Jackson, or, you know, edited by Peter Jackson. It was shot by, I can't remember the documentary guy's name, Michael something.
That guy, I just found out today from looking at what he had done. He recorded a version of, do you know what Waiting for Godot is? Mm-hmm. It's this famous play, and he recorded a BBC version of it that I love, that I've only seen on YouTube. Had no idea who it was by, like who the director was, in 2001 or 2011 or something like this. And just today I found out he's the director. Mm.
So it's much more complicated than that, and almost like eternally more complicated than any kind of biography could even encapsulate. The documentary, when you're watching this footage, I'm just like, there's so many twists and turns, and and you of course are alerted to the fact that their relationships are deep.
Yes. However, and I don't think I'm saying the different thing to what you're saying, because it's almost like what you're saying is like, we all had like this superficial idea of what happened. In reality, it's so much deeper. And I agree. It's just that it's so deep that it comes out on the other side as being so obvious. Like, oh, yeah, these are kids in their 20s.
Yeah.
With all of a sudden crazy things thrust at them.
Right. I'm not saying complicated like...
Yeah, like hard to understand.
Like there's aliens involved. But I'm just saying like... their relationships are so deep. It's like trying to encapsulate why two people get divorced or something.
Absolutely. And also all of us, of course, we're dumb as it is, but we could have all thought, wait, are these superheroes that are not human, who have these very iconic reasons for doing decisions, or
are they mundane human
beings?
Yeah, right.
Who sit there 1 minute angry at each other, the next minute they're okay, and the next minute they're still angry.
And we'll go into all that detail, but let's talk about Yoko for a second. So as a Japanese American myself, okay, I've always had, you know, a bias of or trying to have a positive bias towards her, because, you know, especially growing up, I didn't have a lot of people I could look up to, you know, and so, you know, there are some great things about her. She's apparently a great artist. I'm not into that kind of art.
Sure.
Apparently, she's a strong person. She's, you know, intelligent and interesting. I mean, interesting enough to entice John Lennon and intellectually stimulate him in a lot of ways. And there's that. And apparently some people appreciate her music. I don't. I found I disliked her even more, not as a person.
No, in fact, would you agree that as a person, I was pleasantly surprised? Like, there was no moment in the documentary where I'm like, oh, there goes Yoko, other than the music thing.
Yeah. But even then, like, right. So she was extremely quiet.
Yeah.
She wasn't, you know, and we could imagine during the White Album sessions, from the descriptions, John and Yoko are sitting in the corner recording number 9, and you could just imagine that Yoko's barely doing anything. You know, it's mainly, and even, you know, and it's true in the interviews as well. Whenever the two of them are being interviewed, John is always speaking for her. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Like she'll say one word and
he's John-splaining.
Yeah. He'll just jump in and so
almost apologetically.
Yeah, I think almost I think apologetically, or trying to cover up the fact that the things that she says are kind of annoying. Like the things that she would offer. So let me give you my opinion, because I'd never seen her kind of, you know, behind the scenes, if you will, as with John, we see in this documentary. And the thing that if I were there, like Paul, I would have been like, okay, she's a pleasant woman, and she's sitting there, and she doesn't interrupt, or you know, she's not trying to, you know, blow up our vibe. But when she does say things, they're like she doesn't understand what's going on. She seems like one of those people that seems like like there was this one moment where John was making a total joke.
Oh yeah, I remember.
He's making fun of him. Oh, it was about masturbation, right? It was like, oh yeah, he turns to the camera and he has like everyone rolling, including Paul, and he's just like, and kids out there, remember that winking does not turn you blind, but it does make you short-sighted.
Yeah, over time.
And he's wearing his glasses, you know, and he's total deadpan, and everyone's rolling, and then Yoko says, "Are you speaking from personal experience, John?" And it's like,
you're just explaining the joke.
Yeah, Yoko, that's the joke, you dimwit. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and you could just, like, that says something. You know, she's one of those people. Like, everyone gets the joke, but she's like 10 steps behind.
But I can see, here is what I was expecting based on my bias. I was expecting you're watching this footage, and all of a sudden, Yoko whispers to John, and John says, Paul, actually, I think we should do blah, right? And then you start realizing, oh no, Yoko's trying to manipulate John.
There was none of that. It was none of that.
There was none of that.
Yeah, and I don't think at least in my later years of understanding, thought that was the case.
Maybe not more recently, but I certainly remember when there's this iconic photo of them in the studio during the Let It Be recordings. And they're looking all kind of sullen around the console, and Yoko's right there. And I remember thinking, why is she interfering with everything?
Yeah.
You know, and she wasn't.
Right.
But you're right. So she was a little slow on the uptake for the jokes. And
yeah, and there were a few other moments like that.
But nothing annoyed me more than...
Right. And then that stuff, like, give me a break. I mean, she not only did that 3 times, apparently, plus during the shooting of Let It Be, whenever she was given the microphone.
Yeah, here, try this.
But, it was multiple moments where she was doing that extremely annoying screaming, but fast forward 10 years, and she did a lot of that throughout her time with John. I mean, there's this iconic moment where John Lennon finally gets to play with Chuck Berry.
Okay.
And Yoko is in the corner on stage with them, screaming into the microphone.
Are you serious?
Yeah, they're playing like Johnny Be Good. And John Lennon, he loves this stuff. You know.
No.
And she's on a microphone doing her screams.
Oh no.
And it's screaming gives screaming a good name. Like her wailing, and it's purposeful. She's an artist, so she's.
But it's not like a Paul McCartney rock and roll scream.
No. It's purposefully the most annoying. And if you've never heard it before, people out there, just Google Yoko Ono screaming, and with John or anyone. I mean, it's something. Now, if I heard it on one song, like they had one song where she did, I'd be like, oh, it's kind of interesting, because it is provocative. But she does it all the time. Yeah. It's like all she wants to do. And she's one of those people, I think, who she did it once like 10 years prior to meeting John.
She got some attention.
And she just keeps doing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just like that kid who just keeps saying the same dumb joke.
And no one's actually told them, hey,
it's not funny.
Not good.
It's not funny anymore. Yeah. Like, it probably wasn't funny it was funny for literally 5 seconds.
We thought you were doing a bit.
In 1954, it was funny for 5 seconds. Stop doing it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there were so many moments like that with Yoko. I was just like,
But it is a different kind of problem. It's almost like I feel a little bad. I'm like, yeah, okay, someone needs to pull you aside. But it's definitely a different perspective than she was actively undermining everything.
No. The Beatles, in fact, I would say, so on one hand, I would say Yoko had absolutely nothing to do with them breaking up. On the other hand, I think that Yoko had everything to do with them breaking up. But not because of her, but because of John. And we've talked about it. We did a whole deep dive on John. Yeah. That John was super abandoned, and we'll get into that later. Let's go into that now, actually. Let's just talk about John's psychology, because I think that's pretty important. So I'm going to do a little...
Oh, and I'll say that to echo what you're saying about that she has something to do with it, and maybe it's because of John. There was that very clear comment from Paul about the conversation they had with George, which... It seemed like a lot of the conflict was relating to Yoko.
Right, exactly. So, which is another pretty huge thing that I heard from the documentary that I'd never seen that clip before. Paul says basically into the camera as George and John haven't shown up, because it's sort of the maybe the worst moment in the Beatles history is this moment. Paul's like, and then there were two, and Ringo will probably leave me too, and then it'll just be me. And Paul says, in an ironic twist, in 50 years, which is, we're 52 years from in 50 years, they're going to laugh
and say the Beatles broke up because Yoko stood on an amp.
No, because a woman sat on an amp.
He says Yoko.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Because Yoko sat on an amp.
Sat on an amp, yeah.
And essentially saying she came into the studio and sat down on John's amp, and that broke us up. And I think what he's referring to, and there's been other stories like this, and some of the super fans might attest to the specifics of this, is that George was extremely bothered by Yoko's presence. Like Paul wasn't enthusiastic, but he's more amiable. George was like, what is she doing here?
And someone pointed out when he was playing I Me Mine, and John started waltzing with Yoko, sort of mocking it a bit. I didn't catch it that way, but I was watching another YouTube video, and someone was pointing that out. I was like, oh, if you already have predispositions of feelings against her, and then you're playing your brand new song, and John's kind of like not taking it that seriously, and then he's waltzing in your face with Yoko.
Right. Well, and then there was another moment where he brings, maybe it was the first time he plays I Me Mine, actually. He's just him and his guitar, and the four Beatles are sitting in a little circle, standing in a little circle. We don't see Paul's face because he's facing away, but we see John as sort of askance, 90 degrees to us. And you hear George playing it, and John says something like, oh, it kind of sounds like something, and it was insulting. And George picked up on it, and he's just like, well, I don't give a fuck if you like it or not. I'll put it in my musical.
Right. Because he was something like, we do rock and roll, not waltz or something.
Right. He's like, yeah, it sounds like something from, which is so John to say.
But why would...
Because the Beatles did all sorts of kind of music.
Not only that, like there's other moments where John's so supportive, like, oh, we got to bring in George's song. We got to, know. It seems like...
Well, it almost seems like John has problems, so let's go into it.
Yeah.
So if this is from our deep dive, and in a nutshell, John had a lot of early chaos, much more chaos than I thought. I'd heard he had a rough time, but let's go into some of the details, and this is just some of the highlights. He's born into a family where the father basically was absent on a fishing ship frequently, and I think both his parents drank a lot. I'm guessing it was an unplanned pregnancy. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, the mom would, as from 0 to 4, he had a lot of bad experiences. His mom would abandon him at home at the age of like 2, or 1, just leave him at home, go out, drink with her, friends and stuff, come home with a new dude every single night, have sex with him.
Yeah.
And John would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and realize he's alone, because she'd probably put him to bed and then leave.
Oh, it's unfathomable.
So he's like, 18 months old, and he remembers this, waking up in the house all by himself, screaming in terror. The neighbors hear him screaming.
Oh my God.
The neighbors, he's screaming so loud, the neighbors hear him. They come over and take care of him until the mom comes home.
Oh my God.
He's sent to live with his uncle for a while. He comes back to the mom. The father kidnaps him because the father would come back from a ship and realize how terrible,
be horrified,
Julia was treating John. And they had so much. And what a wonderful plan! I'll kidnap my son instead of like, well, maybe I should just stay home and try to figure out. So we're talking like crack addict parents level of, you know what I mean?
Seriously, yeah.
And so father completely disappears at a certain point. Mother gives eventually John to her sister, Aunt Mimi, and the uncle. So John's being raised by his aunt and uncle, who were, good enough aunt and uncle, but they weren't like enthusiastic, I think, about raising a kid. Mm-hmm. Plus John had already been pretty much attachment disordered by the time he's 4. The mom, Julia, remarries soon after leaving John, has some kids, doesn't take John back.
Yeah.
Because the father doesn't want John. So John across town
is his family.
is his mom living with other kids.
Oof.
Like walking distance, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He grows up, he's extremely troubled as a kid and a teenager.
Half of what I say is meaningless.
Yeah. He goes to art school, he starts playing music, and he meets Stuart Sutcliffe, best friend. He respects him. He's a smart kid, and then Stuart Sutcliffe dies, of course. Yeah. Then John turns to Paul. And now Paul is his number one, and they're having so much success together. And Paul, being a couple years younger, also having lost his mother when he was, his mother died when he was a kid. But Paul's much more even-keeled.
He had a great family life in spite of the loss.
Right. And so when John would have his ups and downs, Paul would kind of roll with it. Yeah. And I mean, have you ever had this experience where someone, they're so charismatic and everyone loves them, and all of a sudden they just shine a light on you, just how great it can feel? They're just suddenly, it's just like, it's all about, have you ever been in a situation like that?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Well, by the fact that you can't think of it, I've been in that many times. Yeah. There are people who, they just seem like wherever they are, they're the coolest person in the room. And then when they shine a light on you, you just feel like, oh my God, I don't want to give it up. And I think that's what Paul was going through kind of, but also Paul had a, narcissistic streak. So he could kind of compete, but, and they even talk about this in the Get Back documentary. Paul's like, John, you've always been the leader. I was
such a shocking revelation. Did you find it shocking?
No, I knew that already because in the early days.
No, I knew that, but I didn't know Paul felt that way in 69.
Oh, well, Paul was saying you were always the leader until recently. You know what I mean?
But because I always had this impression that, because I knew obviously Paul started the bid and they all looked up to John. Where are we going, boys? To the tippy top, Johnny. But whatever. But I just thought
toppermost of the poppermost.
But what I thought was that by the time the mid 60s rolled around, Paul started, because I early on had the misconception that John was the one coming up with all the wacky ideas. Then I learned that no, actually it's kind of Paul.
Right.
And so then I thought, oh, I see what happened. Paul became like the one calling the shots and blah blah blah.
But so John, I think, was the spiritual leader of the band.
And so I was pleasantly surprised to hear in 69 Paul say, like, you've always been the leader, John.
Right.
Maybe only until recently. Like that was
because you could absolutely imagine. It's hard to see and Get Back, but given everything you know about the dynamics and John Lennon himself, if John stood up and said, "This is what we're going to do, lads," you could just see George and Ringo falling in the line.
And in fact, not only do I agree with that, that is implicitly what happens at some point. Even though all he did was like buckle down and start playing.
Yeah.
I think everyone else did follow along.
Right.
Because eventually because early in the first few days, first couple of weeks, John is kind of just there.
Yeah.
In fact, I wrote in my notes,
he's like absent.
What's up with John?
Yeah, me too. He's completely quiet.
And in the last part, John is there.
Right.
And that made a big difference.
Right.
Yeah.
So then when John, he marries Cynthia and has Julian, but was never... and was trying to attach to Cynthia, but had a lot of conflict, violence, maybe. Yeah. Some people say domestic violence. Some people say not. I could absolutely imagine violence. And he's searching for attachment he's never had. He's had a little bit with Stuart Sutcliffe, a little bit with Paul. But, there's only so much you can get from a best friend. Frequently, a lot of people, they really want that full enmeshment with a companion.
And I keep reminding myself, kids in their 20s.
Right. Yeah, they're not the most mature people on the planet. And then he meets Yoko and falls deep in love.
Right.
And even under normal circumstances, Paul would become a distant second to that. But given how desperate John is for closeness for the first, and she's older, she is stable. I think she really gave him a lot of love, gave him a lot of attention, and was just a good match for him, apparently, enough that by the time we get to Get Back, Let It Be documentary, Paul is just like non-existent in John's emotional world at this point, and then of course we have the fair amount of drugs. Both John and Yoko were using heroin by now, and that's what I was thinking at the beginning of the sessions. That
I mean, they didn't feel totally wasted or something.
No,
but
they didn't seem like they were nodding off.
Right.
But one of the nights they actually refer to in the morning, they're like, "Oh, I had a rough night last night," and Paul says, "You really want to be doing this in public right now?" Do you remember that?
Oh, I did. I mean, I remember that moment, but I didn't understand it.
Yeah. So, I watched this other YouTube video kind of breaking that down. So there's this famous night where John and Yoko, late at night after using a lot of heroin, are being interviewed, and it's on camera, and it's like a famous clip of the two of them, like clearly,
intoxicated.
Wow. And the next day and John even talks about it, So there's John, used heroin. I'm guessing, I think he might have even said this out of a self-medication from his attachment disruption and every day.
He must have been in such pain.
Yeah. So you have the fact that, and then you have to add on Brian Epstein dying.
And that's devastating.
Right.
They referred to him as Mr. Epstein.
Right.
Which I was a little surprised, right? I thought they'd call him Brian.
Yeah.
And they're like, Mr. Epstein, since
well,
he
they
died.
even literally called him our father, our father.
And it's incredible to think just what that felt like to them, because they were kids picked out of the street by this guy, basically.
Yeah.
Out of the cavern, so to speak. Devastating.
So take a guess how old Brian Epstein was when he died. So, he's died.
Like 33 or something?
Yeah, 32. So he was just like 5 years older.
But that's a big deal.
5 or 7 years older than it.
And he was clearly an older soul.
Right. More business-like, yeah.
Like there's a guy I worked with who was only about 2 years older than me. He always felt like a decade older than me. Right.
That's definitely that case. So if you don't know, Brian Epstein was their manager for a long time and was pretty instrumental in their success. And he died of some people think suicide, some people think accidental drug overdose. Either way, he dies in mid 1967, and you can clearly see the vacuum of Brian Epstein. And I always thought that George Martin was more of a father figure.
I wrote this in my notes as well. The other thing I was shocked,
because they make fun of him a lot.
There was that. Also, I was in shock of how little control he had at this point.
Yeah.
Forget how they felt. I just thought, well, he's still the head at EMI, like the head. He's not the head of EMI, but he's super high up now.
Right.
And he's the Beatles producer.
And he keeps coming into the group saying stuff, and they keep ignoring him.
Yeah.
Like, I think they didn't like there was this thing like, oh, well, you would always say that. Like Paul would, yeah, George, of course you would say that.
And it's bizarre because early on, and certainly from all the reading and on that white book with all the descriptions of everything they did, like George was the man and was the father figure in the music sense.
Yeah.
They absolutely listened to what he said.
And with Brian Epstein, John and Brian were like really close.
That's right.
And so because the leader of the band was very, was shining the light on Brian Epstein, then the band followed what Brian Epstein did. And you just got to wonder if Epstein hadn't have died. I'm sure Magical Mystery Tour, the movie, never would have been made because that was a fiasco. This documentary would have had some kind of a flow, some kind of organization. They probably would have stayed together. The White Album wouldn't have had number 9 on it. Do you know what I mean?
I will say one thing though. As we're talking about this, I still again keep coming back to, even with Brian not dying, even with maybe George Martin still having more of an active role, all these things. How much can you expect from people?
Yeah,
a decade of the most life-changing music of all time.
Right. Well, before we go on to that, I just want to talk about Brian Epstein a little bit more because there were some things that were directly said. I think it was Paul or someone was saying, we've been in the doldrums. You either said, since Brian Epstein, we've been in the doldrums. Right. And I can't remember who, I think it's Paul. He says something like, we've always lacked discipline. And you can tell from this documentary how much they, particularly the non-Paul, or I guess particularly the John, honestly, it's because George, I think, probably had discipline in the studio. I think Paul did too, but I think John, he's such a obnoxious disruptor.
Well, George might have had discipline, but George didn't have the chops that Paul had. So
right.
when Paul is demanding better this and better that, it frustrates George because he's like, I'm doing the best I can here.
Well, but the amount, so, we've always lacked discipline. It's just like, wow, because you hear outtakes from recordings even from 1964. You can hear him joking around a lot, but they're more deferential to George Martin at the time, right. And of course, Brian Epstein.
Well, and to more specifically, that first album and maybe the first three albums, he even calls it, I was watching the Paul McCartney thing with, and he says, oh, when the adult told us what to do, we had to listen.
Right.
He called him the adult. It very much was like, we are being paid by these people. We better listen to that guy.
Right. Yeah. And he also says, Daddy's gone away, which is Brian Epstein. So the vacuum that this left, and then that, who do you fill with that spot? Yeah. I mean, George Martin would have been a good choice, but apparently they didn't want him. And plus, he's not a manager; he's just a music guy.
And John was clearly motivated and "quote unquote" disciplined enough early on to get them to like go and play and go to Hamburg or whatever.
Right.
But at this point, his life is so different. He's not in a place where he can do that.
There's a billion more things to keep track of.
Yeah.
Like it's not just go to Hamburg and play.
Right.
Post up at one and
stay
club.
Up all night.
Yeah, and take. Those pet pills. Did you hear Ringo talk about pet pills?
Yep.
So he's asking Mao, like, hey, you got any pet pills? But anyway, there's so many more things to keep track of. And so Paul steps into and John is with Yoko all the time, and I'm guessing using heroin. And he was already kind of checked out anyway, I'm Only Sleeping, which was written in 1965. Apparently, like that, he was already because of his attachment injuries, I think depressed and would sleep a lot, because of his depression. So painful. And so Paul steps up, and he's a natural leader, and he right. knows what he's driven. He he clearly knows what he's doing with his.
He just doesn't know how to get them to do it.
Right.
Other than maybe Ringo's a soldier. He's always just like, what do you want me to do, boss?
Right. Ringo. Yeah, that was interesting. I never knew how passive Ringo was until watching this.
And I always knew he was a solid drummer, but man, what a TikTok. Like that guy.
Yeah. And a lot of the beats, Paul would be like, do this.
Yeah.
And like a lot of the beats that I associate with Ringo's, and I'm sure many of the Ringo, but like, the da 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 dun 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 da 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 da, like he just, and that was a whole other thing. Now we're just kind of nerding out. Yeah. Like Paul's ability to write on the spot.
My other comment
is
here,
godly. Like the Get Back song comes out of him out of nowhere. And I sat down while watching it. I paused it because I wanted to analyze the melody, because it's a pretty simple chord structure. Yeah. It's just A and D, I think. And so I wanted to break down the melody because I'm thinking, I think there's something kind of weird about that melody, and it is. It's not chordally congruent. Yeah, the G there is the seventh of the A, but then anyway, you have to play it on piano and then look at the melody, and it's just like it's one of those melodies that sounds beautiful but is dissonant in all the right places, and bluesy and flows, and the fact that he comes up with that, and then he's like, okay, do this, and he right away, and you're just like, how does a human do that? Like the amount of classic number one hits that comes out of his face, and you just got to wonder if John wasn't on heroin and showed up, like the stuff that they could have done during this
at least 3 more albums of awesomeness.
Yeah.
Here's the deal. I wrote down 3 things about him. One, I said, Paul is such a music savant. That was my comment. I was like, because it's not just that he can come up with these things. He is just musically filled. Everything he says sounds amazing. Even when he's freaking around,
Yeah.
he sounds amazing. Every little noodly thing he plays sounds amazing. Every little thing he does on the piano sounds amazing.
Yeah, and because the one thing, and I've heard this before because I've heard outtakes and demo tapes from all of them. Paul's demo tapes sound good.
Yeah.
John and George's, like typical human beings,
raw ideas.
Well, and their voices, although, George and John have amazing voices.
Yeah.
But on their demo tapes, they sound like crap.
Yeah.
Because they're not kind of. Paul just kind of, it's like he can't sing a bad note.
Hey, that's what I'm saying. Like, by the way, just even more in general about the whole band, and I'll make this point later on, but the TLDR on this is they really work great together. Like, even when they're screwing around on little old covers or whatever, and they don't even remember the parts, it still sounds so fun and amazing.
Yeah. And 100%.
But to narrow down on Paul just, like, everything he touches musically just like elevates.
Yeah.
And his voice can do no wrong.
Right.
He's like, oh my God, that sounds beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that he's working on, and we'll get to the full song list in a bit, but the he's working on like 10 of my favorite pieces of art in the span of like 1 week. The things that he's developing in that week are like 10 of my most important things in this world. Do you know what I mean?
So that scene is amazing because he's sitting there noodling on the bass, actually, right?
Yeah.
And then
he's playing it like a guitar. He's playing an A.
And then the little text comes on. This went on to become their next single.
Yeah.
And of course, we know the song, but like, imagine you don't know. And you're like, wait, that thing he's just noodling around with?
Yeah, and you can hear it slowly emerge, and you're
It's
just
so
like, I
amazing.
know where you're heading.
And then when he's playing Let It Be on the piano and everyone else is talking and what are we going to do about that thing? And when are we going to play the show? No one's paying attention. And he's writing my favorite song of all time from the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's so amazing.
Yeah. And anyway.
We could geek out.
Yeah. Let's take a break. But just before we go to break. I cried at the end when they were working well together.
Yeah.
It was moving to me. And I also the arc of the documentary, there's so much tension that you feel, and you're just like, oh, they're fine. When they were on the roof and they're not joking around and they're not fighting and they're playing awesome music, and you see people on the street just like, oh, I think that's the Beatles. They're great. I love them. And it, they're happy, and it's like, and this is the last time they're ever going to perform in front of anyone again. And
they're so good. Keep in mind, they've only had these songs for a few days.
Yeah.
Practice them a few days. They're so good that the recordings we know and love from those albums,
they're on a
many
roof.
of them are from that freaking roof.
Yeah.
Live.
Yeah.
Sure, they had multiple takes. It's amazing.
Yeah.
By the way, I watched this whole thing, all 8 hours, with my 10-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
And she sat through all of it.
Really?
Yes. Now,
so that was what I was thinking. Because I was thinking, well, one, I think a kid watching, it'd be a little different. But I was thinking a non-fan. Is she a fan?
Well, only because I am. And I'll say this. I did write a note. I said, who is the audience for this documentary?
It's you and me. Because even people who are fans, because I'll tell you, it was too long. It was way too long.
For 99% of the population on Earth, it was too long.
Yeah. Well, no. Even, I would say 99.9, because you and I are in the top 1% of people. But
I'm the only one. You and I are like, I'll sit through all of this.
Because the second part and the third part, there were so many parts of that where I was like, I don't think we need to watch them do another random take. You know what I mean? Like, it's made for scholars. And
I wrote down, who is the audience for this? How many of us are there?
Yeah.
But actually, my daughter, now, was she paying 100% attention the whole time? No, she doodled. But she sat through all 8 hours and was mostly fascinated, and that was amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right, let's take a break. Get back. More nerding out. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
Hey, deserving listeners, as y'all know, I am constantly recommending that people go to therapy. We all need therapy from time to time. Well, one of the options available that is definitely worth checking out is BetterHelp. If you're looking for a therapist, I would give it a try by going to betterhelp.com/Kirk. Make sure you use the promo code Kirk because you get 10% off your first month, and it really helps us out. As you watch these videos, I know many of you have been motivated to find your own therapist, which is great because you deserve it. And I know also that it can be hard to find a good fit, find the right one for you. Well, one of the options available in terms of your shopping is to go to betterhelp.com/Kirk. I've been told you can start communicating with your therapist in under 24 hours. You can message your counselor at any time. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. I've also been told that it's often less expensive than in-person therapy, and you should know that this service is available to clients worldwide. So go to betterhelp.com/Kirk to get 10% off your first month today. All right, we're back from the break. It's time to do another OPP, Old Patron Praise.
OPP!
So these people became patrons of the podcast in April of 2019. And
catching up to us.
have stayed patrons ever since then. That's the key. It's like, it's one thing to become a patron. It's another thing to stay a patron through thick and thin, through Beatles episodes and all the other ones. We got Brian from Indiana. We got Jeff from Santa Barbara.
Ooh.
We got Claire from San Francisco.
Nice.
We got Alexandra from Indiana, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania.
Wait, what?
There's an
Indiana, Pennsylvania. Why are you confusing me?
Yeah. Angel from New South Wales, Australia.
Whoa.
Who is an upper tier patron. We got Oli from God knows where. We got Chris from God knows where. We have Irene Denisa from Dublin, Ireland. Eden Denisa, maybe. We got Gianluzi from St. Gallen, CH. You think that's Czechoslovakia? Wait, is Czech Republic, I mean?
Czech Republic.
Country.
Yeah. Let's go Czech Republic.
Code CH is Switzerland.
Wait, we did this last time.
Yeah. Well, how
we
come,
fell for it
how
again.
why is it?
Are we going to do this every time? CH is Switzerland, all right?
Okay. All right. I'm never going to remember that because it's like, okay. And then we got Claire from God knows where, Luke from God knows where. Nia Ann from New South Wales, Australia. And
another one. Okay.
Darlene from God knows where. Thank you all for becoming a patron and staying a patron through thick and thin. I am going to take a little second to organize my sitch here so that I don't repeat those names in the future. Okay, so, all right, let's talk about what we liked about the documentary that we haven't I'm going to go through my outline here. Let's try to follow it. I've been all over the place. But so what do you like? What are some general things you liked about the
Oh man, there's so many moments. So I'll just go touch the 3 episodes separately. The first episode, the top things that I wrote were the Curb Your Enthusiasm episode between Paul and George. And what I mean, if you've never watched Curb Your Enthusiasm, it's full of awkward moments. So the whole time when Paul and George are passive aggressively, going back and forth, and Paul's like, well, I just think, maybe you could do this or play that. And George's like, well, I just don't think that's necessary, they're neither of them is getting like angry or loud, and maybe it's because they know they're being filmed, but you could cut the tension with a freaking like. Well,
so a side note on that is I was wondering if this is a British thing because I was like, wait, George is leaving? What happened?
Well, because he stands up and he's like, oh, where are you going? Oh, I'm leaving the band.
Yeah, and and I'm thinking, wait. And then I was like, oh, I bet you as a subtext to all the polite talking and debating was seething anger.
Yeah.
And frustration.
Yeah. Well, and you could tell, some of it was, bordering on the rude, but just short of it,
Yeah.
And so that was very interesting. It was also a little painful to watch because it brought back a lot of memories of my own experience.
Right. Well, we'll get to that in a second.
But that was very interesting. The other thing was the part about the chord. There's a point where they're trying to do Paul is arguing like, oh, there's a chord. That chord's too plain. And then George is like, there's nothing wrong with this chord. This chord is used by everyone.
Oh, right. You know what chord it was?
No, it was like whatever normal seventh chord or something.
Well, it's the chord that Jimi Hendrix uses in,
Okay.
Yeah, it's that chord.
But Paul was being a little pedantic about it. And George's like,
wait, so
fine.
these are moments that you liked about it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because it's like, because they're real moments. And as a music geek, I'm like geeking out on that, know. And then the other thing was that moment when George leaves. Yeah. Like, I was so shocked. I'm like, what just happened? Because at first you think he's like, it's a misunderstanding.
Well, we'll get into that because there's some details.
It was like such a powerful moment.
Oh, okay.
And then the other things for me are as I mentioned, when they're talking. Oh, I didn't mention this, but when Peter Sellers shows up, I was like, another Curb Your Enthusiasm moment. He sits down, and you're expecting Peter Sellers, this comedian, to be like joining the conversation, maybe saying some witty things. Instead, he's like, what's going on? Because John is just saying random stream of consciousness things, and Paul's just kind of half going along. And Peter Sellers contributes nothing, gets weirded out, stands up, and says bye. Mm-hmm. It's so awkward. And I love Curb Your Enthusiasm, so hence I love that. And then the other part is I got really jealous as I was watching the second episode of how much their whole life revolves around music. Like they wake up, they go, they play all day long.
Then they go home and they write.
And I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing, you know? So watching that was it. I also really enjoyed watching Ringo because even though he said very little, I was like, man, he's such a rock.
Yeah.
He's always there. Yeah. He's always on beat. He's always ready to go. And then the last couple things here. The George's boots. Did you notice his boots? They're like these psychedelic, crazy pink, purple, fluffy boots he's wearing.
Well, I remember the moccasin boots that he was wearing.
Oh, these were like, I think in the second episode and third episode, there were these like just outrageous
they're outfits,
boots.
because of course we all know their outfits for the Roof concert, which are just iconic. But it's kind of, I kept, as they were gearing up to that concert, I was, there are all these different outfits. They showed up every day, and there were kind of variations, like the coat that John wore on the Roof, he wears a couple times. And the jacket that Ringo shows up with on that day.
Red jacket.
It's like, where did that come from?
So cool.
And
then Glyn Johns walks into the studio wearing a fluffy thing with the big glasses.
Right, very kind of David Bowie-ish in my mind. Anyway,
I also love the moment when Michael and Glyn go up to Paul and suggest that they play in the Roof.
Yeah.
I didn't know that's how that came about, right?
Yeah, that was amazing. And you just see Paul like, yes.
Oh, yeah.
That's perfect.
Because it's his way out, right?
And he was crying before that. He was like upset. He's like such in the dumps. He's like, this whole thing is falling apart. The band's falling apart. These recordings sound like crap. No one wants to play a show. You can just see how he evolved, because in the beginning he's like, let's do this, let's do that, let's do that. And then
they broke him.
And there was this constant pushback. Yeah. And some of the pushback was justified, which we'll get to in a bit as well. But then eventually he's just like so broken. He's just like, yeah. And then I think they thought, oh no, the one person that is sort of driving this boat is like taking his hands off the wheels. We have to go up to him and say like, no, how about we try this?
And his face lights up, and you're like, because you can see the wheels turning. Oh, that's my way out here.
Yeah.
Yes. John trying to play the bass, and I felt so bad for him because he didn't really know the song, and he's just go boom, boom, boom. And so then you see George Martin like babysitting him. Like, remember this?
I remember that. He's
playing bass during Let It Be, or maybe it was The Long and Winding Road. Yeah, maybe it was The Long and Winding Road. And and that was amazing, seeing them coming up with all the Abbey Road tracks.
Right.
That was so fun to watch. I learned after this that they started recording Abbey Road 3 weeks after the end of this documentary.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. And then lastly, this is so ironic.
They basically made 2 albums in 3 months.
Yeah, it's which was par for their course, I guess. Paul says at one point, and no one can produce the Beatles. And it's so ironic because sitting right behind him is George Martin.
Yeah.
Anyways, I have a ton more, but those are some of my
Yeah, for me, I liked seeing how they created and also just how minimal their equipment was. They just have like Fender twin amps and a Telecaster and
Fender Bassman for the bass.
Yeah, and the drum setup is, classic Ringo, just a kind of the sort of drum set that you'd buy like a high schooler, you know what I mean?
And he plays his Hofner because it's lighter.
Right. That was a detail that I was like, oh, because I always thought he had that
the Rickenbacker
to like bring back.
Oh, right.
I thought he wore that on the rooftop concert because he was trying to like bring them back to basics. He was trying to like remind the band of like where they came from, but he just likes it because it's lighter. Because some basses are heavy.
Oh, I know. I know.
Yeah.
I have a 6-string or 5-string, right? And that thing, remember when we were playing Electric Company? Yeah. And I almost knocked Mitch unconscious with that thing.
Yeah. I also liked how Peter Jackson and the team made, because I know what they were working with in terms of the source material, and I was like, how are they going to piece together a cohesive story here? And there were several beats, little story nuggets that they told that I was like, oh, they're piecing together like 5 different bits here and staying true to the story, but if you saw what they were working with, you'd be like, oh, they took a look, Paul turning his head from 5 minutes later and put it there because it makes sense to put it there. I just, because before I watched this, I'm like, how are they going to make this into an interesting, especially the stuff in Twickenham I found. That's why I loved the first one. I loved Twickenham and I loved the rooftop concert bit. All the stuff in the, when they were in the basement, it was way too long for me.
The second episode is what you're saying was long.
And the beginning of the third. Yeah.
I totally agree. I found it fascinating for the conflict and the struggle of it, as well as all the.
But it could have been condensed.
No, I hear you.
To like 25%.
As a geek and a recording musician.
So while you were watching number 2, was there ever a point where you're like, okay, get on with it?
No, but I totally see why.
I was, because the other part of it is, for me, this album, the songs that they recorded are not some of my favorite songs. Like I can't, other than Let It Be, which is a great song, and I've heard it, God knows how many times. And Across the Universe, which was barely, performed by them on this, if at all, honestly. A lot of these songs, I'm just like, I don't need them working on Don't Let Me Down again. You know what I mean?
What's funny about that? I did write down this comment that as I was listening to this, see, I take a lot of those songs for granted. I sort of agree with you. It's not my favorite album, but some of my favorite songs are on it. But I actually realized the sound of these songs was very stylistically different. Yeah,
right. Because it's, obviously you have Magical Mystery Tour, which is very much like, Sgt. Pepper's psychedelia stuff. And then you have White Album, which is kind of, well, obviously they're all over the place on that album.
Right, but this one sounds like...
Almost like a different band.
Almost like a band at Woodstock entering the 70s.
Right.
And there was something impressive about it, because I'm like, these are the same guys that just like 5 years ago were doing like really poppy stuff.
Yeah.
And now they're doing even jazzier sounding stuff.
Well, it sounds mature. Yeah, for
now,
sure.
I can understand why, different people might not like it, but I did have that appreciation. And then some of the songs that I usually wouldn't have appreciated, I was even like, that's interesting,
Right, yeah. I have a new appreciation for those songs, but not... Anyway, so I also like how they, prior, they did a little intro of a very quick primer on the Beatles' history up until that point, and I liked how, and I never knew this, that the decision to do Let It Be, the film, was based partly on their experience, not only them trying to avoid playing live shows, but also their experience recording Hey Jude, as you say.
Hey Jude.
in that, because it was just before that. It was just like months before that.
5 months before.
Yeah, and so they recorded "Hey Jude," thinking that they wanted to make a live performance.
Sorry, I know why because I got confused because the name of the song, it was supposed to be Julian, right?
Yeah.
And
well, it's supposed to be Jules,
but it's about Julian.
Yeah, but the original lyric was "Hey Jules."
Yeah. And for some reason, I interpret that as Yule, but it doesn't make any sense. Sorry.
Good story.
Yeah.
So
I'll tell it again.
So they're recording "Hey Jude" as a live performance that's being filmed, and they're going to put that out instead of going out on the road. And they liked how, and they recorded, similar to "All You Need Is Love," part of the tracks live, and then they use some overdubs to and they're like, what if we did actually all of it live? How like honest,
14 songs,
how like authentic that would be.
Yeah.
And I think they really, particularly Paul, loved having an audience, like he wants like fans there in front of him. Paul loves fans. He loves to be on stage. I mean, he's 80. He's almost 80 years. Well, he'll be 80 the next year, I think, or in a couple years. And he still loves playing live, and he's going on all these radio shows. Like he clearly loves.
He does,
the limelight.
Yeah.
And so he's doing "Hey Jude," and he's just like, wow, this is for one song. Imagine if we did this for 14 songs. And so I liked that kind of like, oh, okay, I could, seeing how each step of the way informs the next step.
Which is interesting because when I was watching this, I noticed how John is always performing, but he's performing for everyone indiscriminately.
Right.
He's just always on.
Yeah.
Well, except when he was quiet.
Which I have to say, I would, on that topic, I would get so tired of that. It's like some of it was hilarious.
Yeah.
But 90% of it, I'd be like, John, will you just calm the fuck down?
I'm sure I'm mostly appreciating it because it's John Lennon, but I'm seeing how you're seeing it too.
Like, okay, so let's go on this jag for a second, because we've been in bands with each other and with other people.
Yeah.
And as usually the leaders of these bands, you and I, when we were in a band together, we led together.
Yeah.
And there's always this thing that happens in practices, particularly where people start joking around or they start just jamming on something, and sometimes that can be fun and other times it's a total waste of time. Particularly like, as you get older, you only have like one night a week that you could really practice.
Right.
You're probably paying for a practice space, you don't have enough money for that, and you got a show coming up, and it's just like, hey, let's get our shit together. And obviously, I loved joking around, and I was never in a band that wasn't with my good friends. I was always in bands with good friends of mine. So obviously, joking around was a part of it. But I've never been in a band that joked around as much as the Beatles did. They joked around more than they worked.
Now, totally true. At the same time, we're also talking about
the absolute crap out of me.
Right, but we're also talking about 60 hours of footage. I've never been in a band where we played that much all the time. You know what I mean?
So you're saying that you think it was a minority that they...
No, I don't know. I'm just saying that I take it with a grain of salt because it's an edited movie.
Even if it's, what I'm seeing is 5% blown up.
Well, imagine you and I were playing music 8 hours a day for 3 weeks straight.
I would not be joking that much. I'd be like, let's get our shit together, people. And they were on a deadline.
They also had a different background than us. Like, it's amazing how many songs they had in their head.
But, I don't think it's a good album because they didn't work hard enough.
Yeah, they didn't focus, that's for sure.
And imagine if they had focused or given themselves another month.
Well, it's honestly amazing. Look, there's obviously a lot of footage they didn't show us of them running through the songs really close to perfectly before the rooftop performance.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's completely unbelievable that you're freaking around the whole time and then you go up on this roof and you're perfect.
Well, I think part of it, and I'm not sure about that, because
I'm not disagreeing with you.
Because Paul at some point says something like, look, if we're in front of people and the cameras are on, people will finally and he even points at John, particularly him. He won't essentially what I think Paul was saying is, if there's an audience, John will stop fucking around all the time.
Well, and they have some sort of weird power, and I think it's from the Hamburg time that they put in, because they are able to sit there. You remember, if we practice the songs differently each time, we wouldn't get them down, right? Like,
no.
Because you have to have that part over and over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
I don't have good memory like that. These guys are noodling around. Sometimes they're playing it this way. Sometimes they're playing. Then they go up on the roof, and it's like, oh yeah, that's the song I know. And it's not. And if you're not a musician, you might not appreciate these little things. You know how it's like, we'll do a harmony, and it's good, but when you listen to it, you're like, oh, you really, that part didn't work.
Well, yeah.
They sing,
their harmonies, they're savant. All three of them.
Yeah.
George particularly, because he's usually singing in the middle, which is always the hardest. All three of them are musical harmony geniuses,
right?
And they have different timbres, but blend perfectly.
And I understand. So early on, George Martin would come up with their parts, but it's not simple to hear what you're supposed to sing and sing it along with the others perfectly.
Yeah, no,
that's super hard.
Paul literally says to George one time, he's just like, yeah, let's do a 3-part, and let's keep it tight, and that's all he says, and then boom, they got it.
Yeah. So anyways, I'm saying I agree with you. There was a lot of tomfoolery, and there's a lot of footage.
If you had a band member like that, no matter how good they were, would they not drive you crazy?
Yeah, of course. Well, in fact, I've had situations like that where someone I won't name on the podcast, but well, because you've also played with them. There were times where I'm like, okay, let's stop. Like, let's.
Yeah, I feel like that was more prevalent when I was 19.
Yeah.
Past, I don't know, 25. I never had another band member who was like that.
Yeah.
Maybe I lucked out or something, but I've always been with people that like took it seriously, you know, and joking around for sure. But like, we're here to do a job.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
no. And then John, what's funny is a lot of the little quips we love from the records were of him screwing around before and after and during the songs.
Which there were abundant things they could have pulled from.
Yeah.
I mean, he was constant. It was almost like he couldn't stop. And I think Paul would do it too, to enter John's world. Like, it made me think like Paul wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for John. I think Paul felt like he had to keep John entertained or something.
Well, and I'll add that some of their co-writing was in fact in that style, right? Like, they would kind of riff off of each other. John would like do a counterpoint to something Paul was saying. Yeah. And it was somewhat, there was a level of goofier playfulness to it,
Yeah. Like sometimes they would play and go like, oh, maybe that's good.
And then John's sitting there in the back going like, and she never caught him, over and over and over. But then at some point like, oh, what if we actually,
Yeah. But so I had no idea how annoying John was. Like, I mean, I would have been like, John, let's just take an hour. You can let out all your jollies, and then can we just get to work, please?
And you could see why this would have annoyed George in particular, because so Ringo is kind of in a weird spot because he knows he's not like anywhere near the main songwriter. He's written a couple of things, but mostly it's everyone else. But he has an important role to play, and he plays it well. So he's just sitting there, not rocking the boat, being tight, always on, ready to go.
Yeah.
So he doesn't, at least in this documentary, have much of an opinion about what's annoying him or not annoying him.
Yeah. It's almost like he's not. And a little side note on that, I think other Beatles have said that other times, that for Ringo, he was always the new guy because he entered the band late.
And that psychology would have stayed there, of course.
Right.
And, and maybe again, we were only seeing the edited version, but it's 8 hours worth. Paul, even when he's telling Ringo ideas of what to play on the drums, it felt like they've done this so many times. This wasn't like a new thing for them.
Right.
So it never seemed to me like Ringo was like, stop telling me what to do.
Right.
But George just started to feel different because it was not that Paul was saying, hey, what if you played this? It was more like, paraphrasing, like, you're not playing right. And George going like, this is how I play. And John goofing out all over the place.
Let me follow my outline because I want to get to that for sure. So I loved hearing them also noodle with various songs that we were talking about. And I just want to name like the songs that, and maybe there were more, but Across the Universe is one of my favorite songs of all time. We hear Another Day, Paul messing around with that. Eventually he releases that on his own. We hear Don't Let Me Down, of course, Get Back. Golden Slumbers goes on Abbey Road. Her Majesty goes on Abbey Road. I Want You goes on Abbey Road. I Me Mine. I've Got a Feeling. We hear On the Road to Marrakesh, which becomes Jealous Guy by John Lennon.
Yeah.
On the road to Marrakesh. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's so funny. I'm so glad he changed those words.
I know.
Like,
because the melody was always beautiful,
but
he didn't have
the original lyrics were so dumb.
Yeah. He didn't obviously have the music down yet, but you could already see it. But the lyrics were,
yeah. Let It Be, Long Winding Road, Octopus's Garden, which goes on,
and that's like super cute moment where Ringo's sitting there
and
showing them, and George is helping him out,
right.
and like, what if you do this to resolve it?
Well, and I feel like George should get a writing credit on that song because he writes like half of the verse.
But I also saw that it seemed like they had this kind of general understanding that, because like other people were throwing out lyrics and things, and it's like, look, if I were Paul and someone's like, oh, I should get a writing credit, I'm like, I'm Paul freaking McCartney. Back the fuck up.
Yeah.
If I'm not going to use your word now. In fact, I'll never use your word. But if I am George and Ringo's writing a song, I'm not going to try to take his credit because Ringo only wrote a couple songs.
Yeah.
But
Oh Darlin', which is from Abbey Road, Old Brand Shoe, which became a single. Sitting in the Backseat of My Car is arguably top 3 Paul McCartney songs.
Oh, really?
Including Beatles songs,
wow.
maybe. Sitting in the Backseat of My Car.
So you must have been thrilled to hear how.
I didn't, and I'd heard that he started working on it back then, but but it was pretty close, at least the chorus. Yeah,
and by the way,
this is a song that no one ever hears, but it's this classic Paul McCartney song in the same vein as Hey Jude and Let It Be and Long and Winding Road. It's a piano song, and it has these movements to it. Highly recommend Sitting in the Backseat of My Car, and it's actually pretty interesting lyrics too. It's very evocative.
As you and I both know, it makes sense that a lot of these songs would have already been around because. You've written songs years and years ago that all of a sudden you're like, okay, now I'm going to play this with the band.
Right.
And their albums they recorded, their first couple albums happened only like a couple of years later.
Right.
1 year later.
Yeah. Something by George. Why Am I? Well, he already recorded Why Am I Guitar. Teddy Boy, a Paul song, Two of Us, obviously. And there were other songs, but anyway.
By the way, it was fascinating when George was discussing Eric Clapton.
Yeah.
He's saying, look, Eric can just... Look, first of all, there's only one guitarist in his band. And he's got this ability. He can just like go on this crazy thing and then resolve it. Yeah. I can't do that. That's hard.
Right. Well, we'll get into some of George's personality in a second too. But some dislikes is some of the intro historical stuff was out of order, which bothered me. Did you notice that? I
didn't catch it, no.
Paul said, way too many times. Yeah. Maxwell Silver Hammer... I hate that song, and if
with the anvil, clink clink.
It's I've learned to hate it even more as time has gone. I've never liked it, but one of the things that I find that when I talk to younger people today, because I feel like people our age and older, when you say Beatles are your favorite band, they're like, oh, okay, because people our age and older have enough understanding of the band and their importance or something, and heard the Beatles growing up, that they're like, oh, I could see that. I think there are some, now of course there are some young people, there was like a high school student I had as a client that was like fully into the Beatles. So it's not like, it's not like young people aren't into the Beatles, but it's, of course if there are young people today, even people younger than like 40, who basically have almost no understanding of who the Beatles are.
They think of it as a kiddie band.
Or they're just like not aware of it. Yeah. Like when Paul McCartney and Kanye worked together, people were like,
I remember
who's that guy?
Who is that guy?
Yeah, like why would he be working with this old white guy? And so, which I get, it's totally fine. But one of the things that happens is, as you said, if you have very little understanding of the Beatles, sometimes your only exposure is like Yellow Submarine or Maxwell Silver Hammer
or Bungalow Bill,
right? Or Octopus's Garden.
1, 2, buckle my shoe.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, the Beatles are a kid band, and why would you possibly like? They're like the what's the Waggles or who? What was the what's the band? Is that the 30 Rock band? Anyway, it's a kid band, and So that's why I hate
Fraggle Rock or something.
Maxwell's Silver Hammer and other songs like that by the Beatles even more, because it misrepresents them. If Paul had just had different lyrics, it's such a stupid lyrical song.
I will come out of the closet and say that I don't love it, but I like it.
Ugh.
And I can understand why you hate it.
It's a great. I mean, it's passable chords and melody. It's certainly well produced because it's on Abbey Road. But imagine if it was about like, I don't know, anything else.
Well, I'll tell you why I like it though. It's about a psychopath, and I like American Psycho.
But right, which I'll grant. But the delivery is the way it's purposeful. It's purposely written to please his new stepdaughter, his adoptive daughter, Heather McCartney, who I understand, but don't put it on a Beatles album.
You're saying it's like when Eddie Murphy does a kiddie movie because he's got kids.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. But it's the Beatles, you know what I mean?
I can see that, yeah.
Okay, so personality, we already went into John, but Paul, we already talked about him trying to lead, which I think he did badly, by the way.
Well, I mean, what I think you got right is he had vision, he had ideas. However, he didn't have a crystal clear vision, right?
No. They all were very floppy. Let's take a boat and put a bunch of British people on a boat for 2 weeks to Libya.
Like, I think Paul would have been more successful if up front he would have said something along the lines of like, hey lads, with Mr. Epstein, we used to do this. How about we try to recapture this aspect of it in this way?
Yes.
Here's a proposal. Instead, it was like, oh, we should do this grandiose thing and like do this and this, and we'll get a camera crew. And then before it, probably everyone had processed it. Camera crews are there, and they're in the middle of it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, I did not get the impression that at any point did anyone, and I guess Paul should have because he was stepping forward as the leader, sit down individually with each person, be like, okay, George, we got to work some shit out here because, how are we going to work together? I want, I wish that Paul would have said, George, I need you.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be without you. I want to work with you. I'm willing to compromise. I have all these things I want to do. I get the impression that you don't want to do them. Let's meet in the middle somewhere. Is that okay? I feel like there was none of that,
which they obviously somehow arrived at, probably less eloquently than you just put it, but clearly George came back at some point. But
I don't think so. Right. I think it was because they broke up literally just 3 months later. You know what I mean? I think
it was clearly not a healing.
But this documentary really elucidates how horrible of communicators they were.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, that the conversation,
so much passive aggression.
Yeah, the community, like that secretly, unethically recorded between Paul and John as they're talking about George. I was like, you two do not know how to communicate. Like they're like all over the place. They're not like, hey, they're not leveling with each other. Like, hey, like if Paul would have been like, John, I love the Beatles. I'll go out on my own if I have to, but I'd rather stick it out. We have so much good in what we can do, and the public really likes us, and so we can ride that wave for a long time. How can we work together here? Like, what do we got to do? It was none of that. It was all just kind of like random statements counterpointing each other and never agreeing, and nothing is established.
They were talking around each other, and John kind of wanted it both ways because in the one breath he would say, well, I want to do the live show, and the next minute he'd be representing George's concerns, which is fine. It's just that I didn't feel like in the end I was like kind of unsure where John stood,
Yeah.
And I think Paul didn't know how to corral it all. He just didn't. He didn't have those skills at that point.
Yeah, and his ideas were stupid. Like,
he didn't have.
So that's another thing I'll say is like the John stuff annoyed me. I was like, if I had a band member like John, I'd be like, I don't care how talented he is, I can't work with someone like that. But I've worked with people like the Paul. You're kind of like Paul.
Well, so I wrote down, I said I could really relate to Paul.
Yeah, because you're a dreamer, and you're not as bad as this, but. And plus, back in the day when we would do band stuff together, we didn't have unlimited resources like these guys did. You know what I mean? They could do whatever they wanted, and whole teams of people would play it out. But back in the day, I remember you would be like, what if we did this and we could do that? Like, I'll never forget, there was this one time, I'll never forget this. It's not even that big of a deal, but we were planning on shooting a video for one of our songs, right? And I was in charge. So this is, before everybody had a video camera an HD video camera in their pocket. This is back when I probably had the only video camera of anyone you knew, you know what I mean? And I had the only video editing software, this is like, would have been like 2006 or 5 or something. And so I'm going, let's do a video. And you're like, yeah, let's do a music video. And I'm like, we're like brainstorming. And you're like, no. I totally know what we're going to do. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. He's got an idea. We're going to go to Pike Place Market. We're going to stand right in the middle of the intersection of Pike and First, where all those bricks are. And we're going to like be performing there. And then there's going to be a camera that will be zoomed in on my face. And then as we're performing, the camera is going to recede into the sky, and you're going to see, in all one shot, and you're going to see like Pike Place Market, and then you're going to see the Puget Sound. You're telling that to me.
How were we supposed to do that?
Exactly. This is before drone technology.
But I don't understand how I thought that could even work.
That was what it was like working with you.
Well, okay. I don't remember that story. I wrote down the following. I said, Paul is longing for structure and a schedule. John is stream of consciousness, sort of passive aggressive. And then I said, I basically said, I can relate to Paul because Paul is overthinking things.
Yeah.
And
I said overthinking.
Yeah. And I used to do that all the time. And so like with band before our band, we had our set down and all these things. And I was like, oh, we need all this stage stuff. And so I bought all these stage lights and stage effects and I had this vision. But it was so complicated. And I would spend so much of my time setting it up when we were going to go play shows. Yeah. I was always stressed and I had to set up all the things.
And to be clear, so people understand, you were a simple rock trio.
Yeah, a simple rock trio.
And no one brings their own lights.
And I printed out a huge banner with our name, all these things, right? So anyways, my thing was always like, I was always kind of thinking it through too much. When we were together, I also had grandiose ideas. The only reason like that story sounds a little crazy is because I am aware of how cameras do work. And so maybe what I was thinking is someone was going to be up on the roof or something.
I remember it so well, Berto, because as it was happening, I just remember you, because this is before I really knew you. Yeah. And so you're like, I have this idea. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm leaning in.
Yeah.
And then you proceed to, and I'm the cameraman. Yeah. I'm the cameraman and the producer and the editor. And I'm listening to you talk and I'm like, so what? I just remember thinking like, in what universe is that even humanly possible? You're essentially describing a drone shot or a helicopter shot. But
I must have meant something. Like I must have meant you're going to be up on the roof.
I remember it very well, Berto. You're a dreamer, and this is...
I'm not denying I said that.
This is 16 years ago.
I'm just aware of what's not possible.
You were 100% in the zone of dreaming. You were thinking out loud.
But I'm aware of what's not possible. So I must have thought you're going to be on the roof and you're going to zoom in and zoom out and like you're going to... back, I don't know, who knows?
Well, maybe, but still not possible given what we had available. Which is now I will say when we were in a band together, that kind of annoying dreaming that Paul was doing, and I have that one anecdote. You almost never did that. Like the things that we did together in our band were somewhat grandiose, but we achieved it. Like we had videos and lights and stuff.
But I totally agree, and that's why I wrote down. I recognize that I have a lot of Paul aspects in that sense, and
overthinking, without me to be like, because we would do that, with the band, for example, to say, well, but what can we do, and Paul didn't have that. Right. No, Paul didn't have someone to say, well, okay, so let's
he sort of did. He's just not listening to him.
Well, George
was exactly saying like, that's unfeasible.
But he was being a dick about it. He was like, that's insane. That's a stupid idea.
True. And he was actually like, what if we just don't do anything?
Right. which you got the impression like George often did that, you know what I mean, about various things, you know, like I even think that they're, you know, how they stopped doing live shows in 65, 66, I think largely was because of George. I think Paul wanted to continue doing it, but George never really wanted to.
Be.
And maybe John as well. But anyway, point is that also, as George was being kind of not terribly a dick, but kind of a dick to Paul, I was absolutely agreeing with everything George was saying.
Yeah,
I'm
he was right.
That is a stupid idea.
And but it wasn't just Paul, by the way. Like the yes men around were like, well, we could fly you to Tripoli. Anything's possible.
Yeah, and John was doing it too. Like, you know, there's that moment when they ask Paul about the set design for Twickenham, and Paul is like, I'm not the artist. John and Yoko, they're the artists. So they go to John and Yoko, and then John proceeds to talk over Yoko the whole time. And he starts talking about having plastic walls. Do you remember that whole thing? Yeah. And in my head, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's impractical, given the fact that you have like a week and a half to design all that stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
Oh, two things, by the way. Although I knew that this was coming out, and I knew that there was this documentary about the Beatles from Peter Jackson, I had zero idea what it was about until it started.
Oh.
So in my mind, I thought it was a documentary about the Beatles.
Like there'd be talking heads and stuff.
And about how they got started. And I thought, oh, that's fun. I mean, I've seen that before, but so when they skip through and then they get to the thing and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This is just about that.
Just the footage, yeah.
I was so fascinated.
No, I knew it was because the press releases, because did you see what Peter Jackson did with World War I?
No.
It's the same thing. He took footage from World War I and gave it life.
Okay. I didn't see that, and I had heard nothing other than you and Ron or whoever else saying, have you watched Get Back yet? Right? So I watched it and was completely pleasantly surprised. And then the second thing is that I didn't realize at first, in the first episode, I was thinking, wait, does this conclude with the rooftop performance, or is there something else they're talking about? Is there some TV show?
Wait, you didn't know that?
I knew, of course, I knew about the rooftop performance, and I knew, but because I didn't know what this documentary was about,
you thought maybe it'd just be Twickenham or something.
I thought there was some other show they did, or maybe
because they were talking about this.
And so I was like, what is this going to? You know?
Well,
awesome.
That's interesting because for me, I knew where it was headed, and was. As they were coming up with these ridiculous ideas, I was getting more and more frustrated. I'm just like, just get to the part where they resolve and go to the roof.
And I had no idea how it could possibly resolve to the rooftop.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, how are you going to get from Tripoli to the rooftop?
Yeah. It was, but anyway, a little bit going to my notes here, George, and I knew this before as well from other experts talking about it, that George was clearly insecure about his music in a way that I could relate to. So I could relate to Paul a lot as someone who's trying to get stuff done. I could relate to George in terms of being practical and saying like, that's not achievable. What you guys are talking about is, you know, extremely impractical. Like there's got to be a more practical answer than what you guys are coming up with. So I really appreciated, he was literally the only voice of reason in that room because everyone was going with Paul, you know, all the yes men were going with Paul.
Totally.
The other part I could relate to George was how, you know, because you've commented how I'm this way, and John is kind of this way too a little bit, but not in this documentary, that George would be like, so I wrote a song. Yeah, I don't know. I think the words are stupid. And I feel like this song's just kind of dumb. Your songs are great, you know. and you know, because I'm that way all the time. Like I like my songs, but there are many times when I'll just turn a corner and I'll just be like, everything I've ever done musically is shit. Every ounce, every note, every performance is. Oh, no. I'm just tricking myself. I'm a naked dude in, you know, a rock star emperor's clothes. You know what I mean? I'm acting like I'm a musician.
And I'm like, Kirk, your naked emperor thing's awesome.
But he says like, he's like, he doesn't want to play any of his songs in the show, which he doesn't, by the way, because he says, quote, they'll all turn out shitty.
I know. It's
and
so
you just
sad.
gotta and which isn't true because I Me Mine is a pretty easy song to play.
Yeah,
And so is For You.
And his songs, I really started liking everything he started doing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the other thing is, by the way, when you say stuff like that, it's almost worse. I think if George said stuff like that to Paul and John, they were probably okay. I mean, whatever. But when you used to say that, or whenever you say that, I always almost take it personally, because I'm always like, well, if you feel your stuff is crap, then what's my stuff? Because your stuff is really good, you know.
But your stuff is really
good. I know
good.
you say that, but that's how it makes me feel. I'm like, you can't put yourself there. But anyways,
I can't even listen to Talk to the Girl because I sing a little line in that just sounds like
ask her.
So I sound like a fifth grader trying to sing and doesn't know how. You know, it's just awful.
So there's an interesting thing when I started the band in college. Well, we already had the band, but in college I played with Shun and my friend Dave. And Shun, when he started playing music from zero in high school. And so at first, I think he was also similar to George, in fact, kind of self-conscious about it, because he wanted to write songs, he wanted to sing all these things, but he didn't have the background. But
when did you, just side note, when did you write your first song?
I wrote my very, very first song at 15. It was on a keyboard.
Did you write a lot in high school?
Not a lot. I wrote in high school.
Okay. But so by the time you're in a band at this point, you've already written and thought about music.
And I knew music theory. I knew how to play some piano. Okay.
So you were way beyond Shun at this point.
In that sense, yes.
Shun's just a dude who likes Oasis.
Shun is a dude who had really good music taste and listened to a ton of music. But what Shun did,
except for Oasis,
he started practicing his butt off. Right.
Yeah, clearly.
So in the first year of college that I joined, he was 1 year older. I was rooming with him. We were all playing together, but it was a little bit of a Paul George dynamic. And in my head, I looked to that as a reason why we were going to be just like the next Beatles. Because
so you consciously knew, like, because he's a lead guitarist.
Yeah.
And you're a multi-instrument.
And he's George. And I was the bassist.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, yeah, this is why we're going to be like the Beatles, because it's so silly, because of our dysfunction is so similar to their dysfunction.
Well, the very first band that I was quote unquote in was before I was even ever in a band and before I ever wrote music. I wanted to be in a band and got 3 other guys in my school to be in a band, and I designated all of us to be different roles in the Beatles. You know what I mean? Anyway, so other things that I observed about the band and their psychology that was nice to see in this documentary is how supportive they were at times to each other's songs. Yeah. George helping Ringo out with a song, George and Ringo, as Paul is just riffing on Get Back, and I'm sure they didn't show us the full riff session. He's sitting there working on something kind of, but not really just kind of noodling. Mm-hmm. And George and Ringo are just sitting there staring at him going, and I'm guessing what's happening is they're just like, I think a song is developing.
I think that's another song.
And they're, I think, slightly in awe, know? And eventually George is like, ooh, I like that. You can just see George, and I don't know, it kind of brings a tear to my eye just thinking about like them being nice to each other, like, and supporting each other. And then Ringo starts kind of like, oh yeah, how about you do that a little? That sounds great, like just unbridled appreciation for each other's music.
Well, it was also surprising. What's that John song that he did in his album that he was playing with Paul, and Paul was actually singing quite a bit of it. It's one of the John songs. Give Me Some Truth.
Oh yeah.
All I want is, and my impression was that when John did that album, like I felt like almost every song was an F you to Paul or something, including that song, even though it turns
which was
out,
totally part of the tabloid.
Right. Even though that song, they were apparently writing it sort of together, or at least, they were collaborating with it.
Yeah, you just can't imagine that they would go from this to a year later and hating each other.
And him writing, an actual song against Paul. Like, that's...
Right.
Yeah. But anyways...
Well, we can, because we did a whole deep dive on John and how he would black and white people.
We can understand it, but it is incredible to see that transformation, because, as you're saying, there are very tender moments in here where you're like, oh, there's the Beatles.
Yeah. And John helping Paul with lyrics at times.
Oh, I love that moment when George is playing what will become All Things Must Pass.
Yeah.
And John says, oh, maybe instead of wind, it could be a mind. A mind can blow the clouds away.
Yeah.
Which is such an iconic John thing to do, right? That was always what he was great at, is like a little twist.
Yeah.
And George
and
is
how
like,
fast.
it kind of looks like that on the page.
Yeah, and
You're
how
right.
fast that John could come up with good lyrics.
Yeah.
You know, and how a virtuoso he was with it.
That's another interesting thing, that he had such a facility with sounds. I won't even call it words.
Yeah.
Vocal
Like
sounds.
poetry
Because
stuff.
a lot of the things he says, I have no idea what they mean.
Yeah, well, he's improving with words and images
Right.
all the time.
Right.
It's almost, and I think that's his defense. I think he developed that when he was young as a defense against the tremendous pain he was going through.
Like a little tick almost.
Yeah, like never be honest, always being
Always on
jokey,
act.
and like it was this constant. He was like Robin Williams.
Well,
in this way.
right. And we've talked about how I have some of that, nowhere near to that extent, but like where in a lot of social situations, I have to always be on and always joking. Mm-hmm. And that some of that is useful, but some of it is also self-defense. Mm-hmm. And I can see that because especially in that early part of the documentary, that's like the only time he speaks up is to do some weird thing.
Yeah.
It's like weird.
Yeah,
and then,
he almost never says something directly.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost never just
and it's almost
hey,
like, what do you think, John? Oh, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Always in a weird voice or some kind of silly phrase or something.
And like when they're sitting there and Paul actually says something like, I mean, do you think we should maybe consider the boat idea? And John's like, boats are floating ships that we should look at with our eyes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And then Yoko, hee. Okay, so let's talk about George leaving for a second here.
Oh God,
so
shocking moment.
So this is a famous moment from even before this documentary came out. It's probably like the only scene, if you've ever seen one, that's from. And I was thinking about the pretension, because to me, the way people tell the story is, oh, look at this moment. Paul was a dick and George walked out. But we have to understand that there was years of developing elements that informed what was happening in that moment.
And absolutely, and that the actual math goes back to what I was saying earlier. The actual math in George's head is relatable on a human level. We've all been through this, where we're in a meeting or we're in a situation where like, God, I really don't want to be here.
Yeah.
I think I should just go.
Yeah.
And finally, it got to that point for him. Like, you know what? And he didn't make a scene. And again, I don't know if it's because they're on camera, they're British, whatever. He just stood up. He's like, I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm out. I've reached the point where I'm just out.
Yeah. So we know that he was not respected as much as John and Paul were.
Even George Martin says, like, well, I mean, there are writers.
Yeah.
They're our duo.
Yeah. Right. It's like they're not, no one's like, Lennon.
And John's like,
McCartney.
well, we'll just get Eric Clapton.
Yeah. Right.
It's such a dig.
And George would have to fight to get his quota, as he would talk about it, of 2 songs an album, which in the early days was fine because he wasn't writing much in the early days. He was starting to write more and more, Taxman, other kinds of songs. While My Guitar Gently Weeps are, notable precursors to this moment. John and George used to be, apparently, according to reports, LSD buddies. So it may be like it was John and Paul, and then there was like this transition point where it was John and George for a bit when drugs started, because Paul was like not as much into the drugs.
And George was younger than Paul, which means he was much younger than John.
Yeah.
So I could imagine even just age-wise, at first, John would have a harder time fully bonding with George, and then George gets a little older. And
Right. So at this point, George might be kind of hurt that John isn't shining the light on him anymore. Of course, Yoko being in the studio, and so and from reports, George was the most annoyed by that whole process.
And at this point in the mythology, they aren't just 4 musicians. 2 of them have generated the most hits ever and are like the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
The 4 of them together are a brand.
Yeah.
So George must be feeling that constantly.
Right.
Like, I'm not even important around here.
Right. And being told what to do by Paul, John even says this in that private conversation. John's like, you're essentially, he's saying, Paul, you're extremely particular about your songs.
Yeah.
You tell everyone what to do.
And you don't listen to us at all.
Yeah. But when we bring a song to the group, we do listen to the other members of the group. And so George has had that been happening for years, particularly as the songs become more complicated, Penny Lane, these kind. You could imagine, like with Penny Lane, does George even play on Penny Lane?
And John says something very interesting, which was very surprising. He says, Paul, I don't know how he says it, but it's like, Paul, a lot of times I've done things in my songs I didn't want to do just because you wanted it.
Yeah.
And it makes me feel in that moment, I'm thinking, oh, there must have been a lot of times where at the time, John was giving in inch by inch, like, sure, what's the harm? But it kept accumulating.
Right.
And of course, John had enough base of great songs and stuff to feel secure enough.
Well, and
George didn't.
And Paul is an amazing contributor. I mean,
absolutely.
Like While My Guitar Gently Weeps,
yeah,
I would say 25% of the quality of that song is because of Paul's harmony, bass, and piano playing.
Yeah.
Like with that, because it is the stuff that he's doing on that song is like, it turns it from George just playing his acoustic guitar to, and of course Eric Clapton is playing.
Absolutely.
But the stuff that Paul brings, the harmonies, the richness of this harmonies that he brings to other people's songs. So, I think he has something to say, but at the same time, emotionally. So let's talk about this for a second, because, for non-musicians out there, Berto and I have been in bands where we were together, and we're both leaders and songwriters. We're John and Paul, so to speak. And so there would be there's always this dynamic of, I have a vision. I've written this song. I have a vision of what I want it to sound like. And you're more like Paul in that when you write all the parts in your head, you might even go home and on your computer actually record everything. And then you go, okay, Kirk, play this.
Yeah. Which
was fine.
And I did that not with every song, but certainly some songs like Save Me and others where I literally laid out the whole song.
And we're just like, those player pianos,
Well, to be fair though, I did listen to ideas. Like if someone's like, well, what if we did this? But it is true that I approached it from that
very little. But I never had a problem with it because I just didn't care. And some of your parts are pretty good, like To Save Me, the guitar riff at the beginning is, that'd be something I never would have come up with, but it sounded great. And it made me look like I would have written a part like that, which I never would have. But when it came to my songs, I never wrote your bass lines. I might have given you a suggestion.
You gave me tips or suggestions,
but little, like honestly. Or I might have been like, ooh, I like that note, play that, or don't play that note.
You did veto me playing a note in my own song.
Because it was ridiculous. It was so bad.
Avant-garde. It was the third on the first drop beat of the bass.
I get it, but it was...
No, I'm kidding. It was, in the end, you were right.
Yeah.
At the time... I was like,
Yeah, I get it. I was actually listening to an Interpol song the other day, and that bass is so amazing, and he's like you in that he's like all over the place. And he played this one totally dissonant note at the beginning of every line, but it ends up working anyway. But that's Interpol.
Yeah.
Your song was
and this is a more traditional song.
Yeah, it's like a sea shanty sort of song. And
it worked out great. But I think you and I, the reason you and I actually were able to collaborate in a band, because I struggled a lot with collaboration. Before you met me, actually, it was even worse because I always thought that collaboration, I didn't understand collaboration. So as an example, me and Mitch, whom we were trying to record a song together, and it was an electronic-y type song where we started with someone else's song as a bass, and then we were adding things to it. And I got so excited about it that I stayed up all night finishing the song.
That's right, I forget.
And then the next day, I'm like, Mitch, hear this, I finished it. And I play it, and then the whole time I'm noticing, he's like, really not into it or something. I'm like, what? And I didn't understand that collaboration doesn't mean I go and finish things by myself.
Right.
That happened to me multiple times with people.
Yeah.
So, but I always naively was like, no, I'm putting in the extra effort to finish our thing.
Yeah.
I didn't get it. But by the time you and I worked together, I think I had grown a bit from that. But yeah, it was interesting that Paul has that aspect of like, he wants to control all the variables.
Yeah. And you can't argue with his outcome.
And the results are great.
Yeah. I mean, if his songs were crap.
Although I can say that I think, although he had amazing stuff after the Beatles, there were some things that I could tell no one was saying no to.
Right. Absolutely. Just a little bit more on this in terms of how I worked, in the bands that I have been in, like with Bread Knife Incident, I, had a bassist and a drummer with me, and never did I write their bass part. Never did I write his drum part. I wrote my guitar part, and I'd bring the song and they just start playing. And I would say 90% of the time they took it in a complete different direction that was in my head. But I set that up by design. Yeah. One, because I wanted them to feel like they were part of the band. And two, I knew that they would probably come up with something better than what I would come up with because that's their instrument. So if I get married to something in my head, it'll just prevent me from being open to whatever genius they eventually will come up with. Yep. And so you could see that moment with Paul. They're playing. Is it "Don't Let Me"? Oh. No, it's one of Paul's songs. It's not "Oh Darling." It's the other one that he. I've got a feeling.
I've got a feeling. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got a feeling deep inside. Oh yeah. And what? How does the verse go? Oh yeah.
Please believe me. I hate
Light the
to
days
miss
of
the
change.
train.
Oh yeah. And then there's that break. And George, traditionally in all Beatles songs, will come up with a little riff. Yeah. There'll be a little riff there. Yep. And that's his job. He's the lead guitarist. That's his. If he can't do that,
what does he do?
He's not going to do anything because
John's playing the rhythm.
John's playing, and he's playing kind of a complicated rhythm part.
Right. It's always filler.
Yeah,
filled.
Yeah, he's going to do fills. Yeah. And so George is starting to do it, and Paul's being a dick because he's not like. Yeah, what George was coming up with was terrible at first.
But he's just learning the part.
Right, like give it some time.
So this is the part that I relate way more to George because I was always comfortable with things sounding like crap initially while you're learning.
Right. Well, and you as when someone else is writing a song, you fit well with me because I would let you, and half the time I wouldn't even be listening to you that closely because I'm like, well, we're just kind of jamming.
Right.
But we've been in a band with other people right. who would take massive amounts of issue with you getting to know your part, you developing your bass line. And our band has broken up over those. So we had a massive breakup.
We had one of those McCartney Harrison moments with someone. Yes.
Yeah, that was exactly like this.
So as I'm watching that scene, that was the note I wrote. I was like, oh, I can relate to this moment so much.
Someone just assuming that you're going to come up with something terrible, so don't even try.
And I could relate to it from both sides, to be fair, because yes, I could relate to Paul wanting to control everything. I could also relate to George being like, dude, I'm just learning this.
But you would never have been a dick about it.
Not like that.
You were like, the only time when I really didn't like what you had decided was, and we've talked about this before, we jammed on Aquarian before you had really formed the song, and it was such a euphoric moment because there are these moments in bands when you're jamming on a new song and it's like falling in love for the first time. It's just like it's all nonverbal and you're all in sync with each other and you're just like, oh my God. And it might not even sound that good, who knows, but it feels amazing. And then I'm like, and I kind of came up with this guitar part. You were just like, do something on D and kind of like make it rocky and make it syncopated. And I was like, da 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 da. And I also was thinking, this is kind of cool because I'm putting a little bit of my punk attitude into one of Berto's songs that usually don't have any punk in it.
Right.
This is going to give it some punch, some rockiness to it. And I thought, this is going to be great with and what you were coming up with on the vocals, it was really like
it was current too at the time.
Like it was
a current sound at the time.
Yeah. And then we come back the next practice and you had completely rewritten my guitar part and said, no, play this. And I'm like, you took 90% of the life out of that guitar part.
I am wondering one thing though. I'm wondering if the sequence you have is correct, because here's why I'm bringing this up. We played the what I call version 1 of Aquarian live.
No. So there's version 0. I'm talking about
so you're talking about version 0. Then I changed it for version 1.
Yeah.
We had a version 1 which we played and the Mexicans loved it. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Carlos's Enclave.
Yeah.
Carlos was our Mexican drummer. He was amazing, and he had all this.
He was our drummer. He happened to be Mexican. He's not like our
No.
Mexican
We
drummer.
had several drummers. He was the Mexican one, and he had this.
And he had a lot of friends from Mexico.
And they would all show up to the show.
Yeah.
And they came up after the show and be like,
yeah,
that's an amazing song.
Yeah, it was. It was always a good song, but
then you know what happened?
The only time when because when you would change things my parts, most of the time it'd be anyway.
But so I think there was 3 stages. First, I'm sorry about that. I don't remember all the details.
You probably made it better.
Maybe I don't know. But all I know is I could see how that would be frustrating.
I remember pushing back to you and being like,
yeah.
I'm being like, no. It was so good the other day, and you're like, no, Kirk, this is going to be so much better.
And I'm sorry about that.
I was like,
the third version happened because I was working with a producer, and he sent me a rearrangement, and he gave me tips, and then I followed.
Yeah, the third version was fine too.
The third version is fine. It's just
the first version.
There was something raw about it.
Yeah, it was rockier.
Yeah. Anyways, so sorry about that.
No, it was fine. But I will say, with the bass note that I told you not to play from Dance With Me, I developed that entire guitar part on my own.
That's right.
So you never said do this or that, and that's a pretty key
and part of it is
component
because,
of that song.
as you know, I'm not primarily a guitarist. Oh, this is what I was going to say. I think the other reason why this might have happened to Paul as well, although I'm not putting myself in the same category as Paul, but we're both bassists in the band, and when you write a song, if you only show up with your bass line, what's the song?
Yeah.
So
you have to tell the guitarist
something, right? Now, the truth is, like in the case of Dance With Me, I don't play guitar for real. Like I can come up with stuff and come up with like maybe a lick, maybe a little solo, but I don't know actually. Like the Smiths puzzle me. I listen to that guitar and I'm like, I don't understand what's happening.
Yeah.
Right. So I told you, here's the chords.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad because what you played was beautiful. And it just makes that song shine, glimmer.
Yeah. So there were times when, and I really like the guitar part. And so there are times when you absolutely were just like, do your guitar thing on this song.
Yeah.
Which, anyway, point is that of the Paul moments that you had, there was only one moment where I was like, and I wasn't even that bummed out because it was your song, you know what I mean? I wasn't going to be like, but well, I like that, it wasn't that big of a deal.
I was even more like that with Shun, and I think that was annoying to him, I'm sure, when we were early on, because I'd be like, so everything like has to be this way.
Yeah. So, I think if you're not a musician and you watch that scene between Paul and George, you're like, Paul's an asshole.
Yeah.
But if you're a musician and you're a songwriter and you're trying to make something that isn't just fun for the band members, but actually sounds good.
Yeah.
Then you kind of understand Paul's position.
I also saw an interview with Peter Jackson where he was relating to Paul from a director's perspective.
Right.
Because he's like, dude, we're on a deadline here.
Yeah.
You can't fridge around the whole time.
Right. And what Paul was saying, but again, in a terribly meandering way, let's play the song kind of straight.
Yeah.
And then we'll do the riffs later.
Yeah.
But the way Paul would say it was so kind of, I don't know.
Hard to get and
also kind of dickish. He wasn't like, George, you're an amazing guitarist and you're great.
Right, exactly.
And you'll come up with something amazing. I'm sure you will. And I'm gonna give you a slot and you're gonna come up with something. But I can't even visualize this song until we play it straight. And if
it's noodling all over.
And I need you just to play the chords for now. But later on, dude, I'm gonna throw to you. And
you can do your subpar, weird, ratty stuff later.
So you hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's more direct.
Yes.
And watching this documentary, I was shaking my head so many times, just being like, you four are the worst at communicating. And because Paul, the way Paul would say it would be like, look, hey, it's just like, if we're just gonna, noodle all the time, like, what are we doing? Hey, we got the, how about, it's like all this like fluff. It's like,
and Glenn,
Paul, just fucking say the sentence,
Glenn Johns was too rookie at that point to assert himself. He tried, he would put in a couple of ideas, and George Martin was absent, sadly.
Well, he was there some of the time, but I
mean, like, I was expecting he would be the one I was thinking would come in and be like, hey, kids.
Yeah. So I think the structure before Epstein would have been there, and John would have been like, because there were. And you notice that when John or Paul and George were fighting, John says, "Okay, girls." You hear him say that? He's like, "Okay," he's trying to.
Okay,
like,
girls.
He's like, "Hey, let's stop doing this with some." But you could imagine him 2 years earlier being like, "Hey, the two of you, knock it off."
He was definitely not assertive about it. He was kind of like, and most of the time he was just sitting there passively.
I know.
Whereas I could totally imagine years before, if they've even had such a situation, George Martin goes to Brian Epstein. It's like, hey, can you make sure they understand the deadline or whatever, and then Brian talks to John, and then they can control the situation, and they have none of that structure, none of it.
Right.
And there's too many people around, by the way.
Too many cooks.
So many ideas about everything.
Yeah, too many cooks.
Too many cooks.
So George leaves, and okay, actually, so there's some kind of. Did you know that there might have been a fist fight?
Well, no, that was the rumor, but apparently there wasn't.
Well, okay, so George denies it and always has that there was a fist fight. So. Before George walks out, before the the fight about the song, whatever they're working on, Don't Let Me Down. Yeah. Just before they're working on Don't Let Me Down, George and John are off camera. George Martin has adamantly claimed he saw them fist fighting each other. Not like full on, but it was,
It wasn't the play thing they showed on the.
No.
Where John's like, we're supposed to be fighting each other.
Well, that was later because it was written in the papers because I think George Martin and others had leaked it to the press. But George Martin, who you would believe, and that George Martin wouldn't make crap up, especially because it would make everyone look bad. He said there was a physical fight between John and George. So if that's true, which we don't know,
that would be so sad.
John is going to George and saying, like, I think, because we know that John could kind of swing wildly with George. And I think John was going to George and saying, like, will you shape the fuck up? Like, get in line. You know what I mean? I think that, because I'm just trying to imagine why John would be like yelling at George. And I think, because I think John was like wanting to make it work.
Well, he said that many times. I want to do this.
Yeah.
It's just he wasn't in the right frame of mind or something, but he wanted to do it.
Yeah. And George was poo-pooing a lot of things. Yeah. And so John, I think, went to George to tell him to step in line. And George is like, that's like the worst thing you could say to me at this point. You know what I mean? I've been stepping in line for years now. Yeah. And I don't want to. I don't like how this feels. And then they get into a fight. Then they come back to Twickenham, in front of the camera, and they start trying to work on this song, Don't Let Me Down. Paul is like, George, like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? And it's, building up intention, and then he just suddenly walks out. So the way that it looks in the simplistic version is Paul is an a-hole, and George was just reacting normally. But if you take into consideration that John might have literally punched George in the face about 10 minutes earlier off camera, it certainly kind of makes it so much more complicated.
Don't Let Me Down is when they're sitting there and Paul has this bad idea to do the echoing lyrics.
Terrible idea.
Oh, God.
Again, George
is saying, it's the same shit.
Well, but George is being a dick.
I know.
Like, there's a way to say, I'm just like, hey, I get this call and response, but I just don't like it. I think it degrades the song a little bit.
And it's so interesting that
he says it. I can't remember what words he was saying, but he says it makes it sound like a silly song or something.
And he says something very interesting, which really makes you think that maybe because he was so checked out at this point, he was one of the only ones with George.
Oh, George.
Well, John was checked out in a different way. He was still in the band and everything. He was just
but George was like half in.
George was half in, half out. And maybe because of that, he had perspective that the others didn't have. Because he says, if this was on tape and you're listening to, that's the first thing to go.
Right.
He's like, you would cut that straight out.
Yeah, and that was a great way of saying he should have been more in that vein of like, you are good songwriters, and this is bad.
I suggested
it. So I think you're kind of in love with your idea here.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're George, just be quiet. They'll work it out.
Yeah.
We're in the beginning
phase. Or just express
phase.
your opinion once and leave it alone.
Yeah, and just keep going, and then they'll eventually work it out of the song.
Because Paul was clearly on a, and I've gotten, like, we can relate. I can certainly relate to, like, trying to double down on a bad idea. And Glyn Johns tries to help.
Or you just get kind of married to an idea rather than evaluating how it sounds.
And then Glyn tries to help, and they kind of try his idea, which I didn't hate. I thought it was...
it was furthering the bad idea.
But it wasn't the call response. It was like, you sing once, then you sing, then you guys sing together, then all of you sing.
Yeah, it was awful to listen to. I was just like, this sounds so bad. And then when George says, this sounds bad, I
think it was Glyn's way to... cut out the call response.
Okay.
But it didn't work because then Paul
producer.
went right back to it.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, let's still do the call response.
Right. So as you said, the ages, John and Ringo are 28 at the time. Paul is 26 and George is 25.
Unbelievable.
These are...
Wait, how old is Ringo at the time?
John's age, 28.
Okay, 20.
28, 20... Paul is 26.
Right.
He's 26.
Nice.
He's already accomplished... 20 different musical careers by this
point.
And
emotionally, like, I hadn't had a panic attack yet. I hadn't gone to a therapist yet.
Yeah.
I haven't, like, realized anything wrong with me.
So to go with the timeline that we were referring to earlier, the pandemic, we're almost coming up on 2 years.
Yeah.
So 2 years, just think of all the things you've done over the past couple of years.
Right. I showered.
All the things you... So let's look at what the Beatles had accomplished up until they were recording this album.
Yeah.
2 years pre.
Just 2 years. From 67.
We're going January 69 to January 67.
Oh, it's going to be so crazy.
So early 67, they record Sgt. Pepper. Which is arguably, in all the lists, God. Rolling Stone, whatever.
It's one of the top albums of
always
all time.
top 3 albums of all time.
Yeah, and it's got some amazing songs in it, whether you don't like the album or not.
So. Right, and made rock and roll the way it is today. I mean, it is... Yeah, it's just... And made recording and made band albums, like everything. Later that year, summer 1967...
By the way, not later as in, like... towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
Just 6 months later.
A few months later.
A few months later.
They record Magical Mystery Tour, which is a great album.
It's got amazing songs.
Fool on the Hill.
The whole video concept, not so much, but yeah.
They also perform All You Need Is Love, which was the very first satellite concert.
And they write it on the way to the thing.
Yeah. 1967, they also this year record Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields.
Oh my God, incredible.
Yeah, singles that are amazing.
No, it wasn't Penny Lane the B-side for Strawberry?
No, Strawberry was the B-side to Penny.
Okay, Strawberry Fields Forever is the B-side.
Yeah. Later 1967, they mostly record Yellow Submarine, which is their third album that year. Now, arguably, Yellow Submarine is only half an album, but still. They also, next year, early 68, so at this point, Brian Epstein dies, you know what I mean? Around this time. Oh, they also make a movie, Magical Mystery Tour, which was terrible, but still, they made a movie. Early 1968, they go to India, the 4 of them, and study, Indian religion.
Yeah.
Summer 1968, they record the White Album, which is a double album. So it's essentially 2 albums, but one could say it's 1 album and some outtakes. They also record...
The White freaking album.
Yeah. Amazing album. My favorite. Well, not my favorite.
But it's got some of the best songs in it. It's like...
Yeah.
Oh.
1968, they also record Lady Madonna, Hey Jude, Revolution. So they're also recording major singles, and that's the way it was back then. Singles were mainly what bands were supposed to do in the albums.
Yeah, like I said, only 5 months prior, they've released one of the greatest songs of all time, Hey Jude.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hey Jude.
Yeah. And then they, in 1969, Let It Be. So this is 4 number 1 albums in 2 years.
With dozens of songs in the top certainly top 100. It says top 20.
Yeah, several number 1 singles.
Yeah.
Also, another album that's a number 2 album, Yellow Submarine.
Yeah.
They do a feature movie, which is Magical Mystery Tour, a cartoon movie, which is Yellow Submarine, and a documentary. This is all in 2 years, 24 months.
2 years.
They completely changed the landscape of music and the industry and albums and the culture. You know, I mean,
So
they didn't single-handedly change the culture, but they were a huge part of it. In 2 years, Justin Bieber probably releases and I'm not picking on Bieber, you know, like I said, Radiohead probably releases 2 albums every 10 years.
So I'm sitting here, it's 1990, and it's when I've moved up here, and this is when I started diving into learning more about the Beatles, and I go to the library, I check out books about them and things like this. 1990 is only 20 years after their breakup. But of course, in my mind, the Beatles had happened, 2 centuries prior, right? And in my mind, the early Cavern years is like a whole eon of time.
Yeah, it's like World War I years or something.
Right, and then they had their period of time where they were mop tops, and that was decades, right?
Yeah.
And then they get to the wacky period, and that was a few more decades. Like, to me, everything was these long stretches of time. Yeah. And years later, when they were old, because, they have beards, when they were old, they do the more mature albums.
Yeah.
And then eventually they get to Abbey Road, which is when they're the senior rock stars of the world.
Yeah.
And all of this happened in like 6 years.
Yeah.
Like, it's ridiculous.
They broke up well before 1970.
Oh my gosh.
So they were in operation
63
from the time Ringo entered.
Yeah.
From 63 to 69.
Yeah, I mean, it's 62-ish, but they were really not popular till 63 worldwide.
Right.
And that's 6 years, dude.
Yeah.
6 years. I think there's things that I did 10 years ago that to me feel like yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not the song.
6 years ago was 2015.
Yeah.
We just started on Patreon. You know?
My God, dude.
Like, yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing that I thought about as I was thinking about all that they had accomplished in that time, because I really believe that they were better together. And, John, even as, George is talking about with John, that he has so many songs, and he does, he has so many great songs that he will release over the next few years on Beatles records and his solo records. And John's like, yeah, and George even says something, and I'm just like, oh, it's such a missed opportunity because I wish the Beatles stayed together. George says, if I'm allowed to release my own album, this will make the whole Beatles thing more easy.
Right. If everyone can just do their own thing.
If we can all do it, particularly me, if I can.
Were they not allowed by contract?
No, they were. But it was such a culture of, because John had already released an album on his own by this point.
He did?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Or soon after that.
Soon after. Okay.
Like, or was in the works.
But the point is that it wasn't disallowed.
It was known that John was, and I think he had released all Give Peace a Chance.
It must not have been yet, because George says something like, we could all do this. We could all do our own things or whatever.
Yeah. I think Give Peace a Chance still has McCartney's name on it because they were under contract to write together. Anyway, I don't get at me for that. But point is that there's no contract in the world that would have, especially since they were developing their own contracts at this point.
Oh, that's true. They owned the company that owned the contracts.
So they could have absolutely all released solo albums, and then 3 years later did a Beatles album.
Yeah.
Then a bunch of other solo albums, and then we see other artists do this sometimes. I think Mick Jagger might have his own albums.
It's a freeing sort of thing.
Yeah, and just think of and if they kept George Martin with them, just think like in 1974, what the Beatles could have done together, or 1980, what the Beatles could, because as we've been saying, Paul without John can be very cheesy.
There's a little lacking there, yeah.
And not only in his lyrics, but also in his music. You know, it can be really like bubblegum.
Yeah.
And John without Paul can be unmotivated and lack direction and too much Yoko screaming.
And a little rough around the edges, which is endearing to a certain extent.
But not...
like there's a lot of songs of John's that are really good ideas, but they never were polished.
Right.
Yeah. Now, some of my favorite songs of all time came from John in his solo stuff.
Jealous Guy, Imagine, Woman, you know, Days Like These. And that's the other thing is he eventually came around, John. You know, in 1980, his final album was so poppy, was so Paul influenced, it seemed, you know? And you just think like what they could have done together. And it was like they were so close to achieving that. Like, why didn't they just say, hey, let's not break up. Let's just all do our own albums for a couple albums and let's revisit this. But they were like, nope. And then the tabloids get involved and John starts to black and white everyone. You know, he starts saying a bunch of crap about everybody, you know.
Part of me, though, thinks, would the legend be as awesome and as big?
I know. I was thinking that, too, because, you know, especially with Abbey Road. If they didn't have Abbey Road, this band would have gone out on such a fizzle. Yeah. And it was... the fact that they went out like that means that they don't have bad albums. You know, there's not... like think about there's so many bands where you're just like like REM for example. Like I wish REM would have broken up in 1989 because everything after that point it's just like terrible in my mind, you know. So I could see that. But then you look at a band like the Stones who had hits throughout the 70s and 80s, you know, they kept going.
The Stones did something that bands don't like doing and they were just okay doing. They stuck to a formula.
Yeah.
And I'm like, by the way, I'm not, some of their songs were very
their
creative
70s,
and stuff
their
like
70s
that.
stuff broke from their, I mean, they were always a garage band.
Right. But what I'm saying is, and maybe they just didn't go far enough into the late 80s and things. Well, I mean, I know they're still together, but I mean, they didn't keep putting out more and more different albums because that's what gets in the way a lot for some of the bands, right? It's like, we can't do what we've done before.
Right.
And at some point, the Stones decided, why don't we just keep playing and being in a band because people like what we do already.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just have to wonder what could have happened. And you just also, not only for solo albums, but how about just take 3 years off of the Beatles in general, like from music in general, like they were on a constant treadmill since the day they met, you know, since the Hamburg days, they were probably never not doing Beatles.
Well, and like you were just saying, it was like in those 2 years they did so much. You know, in the Abbey Road documentary, there's in the Abbey Road album, whatever they released a few years back, George Martin's talking about it, and he's like, well, Paul approached me and said he wanted to do another proper album. And I said, with John? He's like, yep. And, you know, I will only do it if we do it the way we used to do it. He's like, yeah. So when I heard that, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, 20 years later, Paul came to my door and knocked. And I know it's not, right? But that's how it sounds. Like you open the door, Paul McCartney, pleasure to see you. This was 5 months later. Yeah. So it's like the timelines don't even make sense.
Yeah.
But it's funny because you can
and that
see,
album is so much better than Let It Be.
Right. And you could see what must have happened. And now it does make sense in context. Why is George Martin appearing to not be doing much in this point of the band? Because he wasn't able to. Because probably before this video or documentary, he had tried and wasn't able to control them. Right. And then only when Paul and the rest willingly are like, fine, George, let's do it your way. One last album. Yeah. Then he's like, okay. Yeah. And I don't know, but there were glimpses of a pattern that the whole band had, or maybe Paul and John, because they did most of the talking. I mean, that was another kind of interesting thing. Like George and Ringo barely said anything. Yeah. It was Paul and John talking, joking. They're both extroverted narcissists. Yeah, exactly. and you could just imagine George just being like, these two guys, you know, and Ringo's just like falling asleep, you know. And it works great at the beginning of the band because especially when you're not that way, you're like, well, we need someone to step up. Right. Yeah. So I thought I saw a pattern
with not only George Martin as they would banter with him just sitting in the room with them, but also with Glenn, their new producer, that they would kind of scapegoat the producer.
Yes.
Like they Glenn would be like, Paul would be like, okay, we'd like to do it again, and Paul's like, oh, he's not paying attention. Well.
Yeah, and then they would make little passive aggressive jokes, like John's like, okay, Glenn, if you're gonna screw everything up or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I know you're not gonna like this, Glenn, but we're the band, so shut up. That kind of attitude, where I didn't think that was deserved for Glenn.
Not at all.
Glenn was being nice all the time.
And I mean, they did it in a way where it was like, we're just joking.
But it seemed.
But if I'm Glenn, I'm like,
like ha ha ha.
The first time was sort of not funny.
So you can imagine that the Beatles in 1965, as their heads are starting to balloon. They're like, oh, Daddy's upstairs, at Apple Studio, like talking down to us. Oh, George,
Right.
And there's even little outtakes from some of the songs in that time where they're like, where you can hear John like kind of taking shots at George Martin a little bit.
Well, and we know from the White Album, like Paul would come in the middle of the night to record, why don't we do it on the road or whatever? And it's like, you could just tell that they were starting to just like veer off. Yeah. And Martin was probably like, what do I do here?
Right. Yeah. So I was just wondering if there was a kind of a way for the band to bond by being rebellious to the producer. The other factor that I don't think we've talked about yet, and we've talked about pretty much everything in 2.5 hours, is this is the late 60s. We all understand the Western cultural youth culture of the time. Like, this was some of the most chaotic years in our history in the Western world. Yep. Not only with the Vietnam War, civil rights, there were shootings and riots and massive unrest, and also very much anti-authority. And I also felt like that was a part of the problem, was that they didn't have an authority, and whenever anyone stepped into authority, there was a constant undermining of that authority by everybody.
Right. They had to, because it was part of the norm.
And the people who were stepping into authority were stepping into it like the way a child would. Instead of Paul being like, okay, let's do a timeline here instead he's like, let's take a boat to Libya. It's like the way what a child would say.
Sure.
And I was just thinking, if it was a different era, there would have been more structure or something. But since, Apple Corps, remember, it was like, we want to be a fashion and a art thing and a music thing. It was all outside of the box. Everything was like big and weird and new, and like, we're free now, we can do whatever. And I think that absolutely was a factor in the ridiculousness of the planning of this whole thing. Right. Even from the beginning, like you said, you could just imagine Paul being like, hey, let's do this. And then they have all this money to throw around.
Right.
And the cameras show up.
Well, that's something that, if you're casually watching this and you're not aware of the cost of recording equipment and what it takes to, when they're like showing up with an 8-track console back then, it was George Harrison letting them, and he's like, well, it's 10,000 quid. 10,000 quid at the time was a ridiculous amount of money. And the fact is that some of these things were one piece of a kind, because like they built it for him or they did this or whatever. And everything there is expensive. But EMI was like, there's no mountain we won't move for the Beatles.
Right.
So,
because they're taking so much of their money. Right. And they kind of talk about that too.
Yeah.
And then
they're like, we subsidize EMI.
Yeah. And then the other interesting thing about John's psychology was how smitten he was with Alan Klein.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Do you know much about Alan Klein?
No.
So from other documentaries, Alan, and I don't know the truth of this, but you heard...
that was the Rolling Stones?
Yes. I don't know. But he's an American music promoter, like
is that the guy he went to meet with till like 1 a.m?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was one of the Rolling Stones for a little bit, like their manager or something.
Okay.
But apparently Glyn Johns and other members of the Rolling Stones didn't have a good time with him.
Right.
Yeah.
So he was reportedly a total con artist, And
really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And was, I think in the end, fleeced the Beatles of a lot of money.
No.
I'm not sure, or was going to, or I don't know.
And they had already lost money before that.
Well, see, that's what they were looking for.
Yeah,
and you hear them talking about that. They're like,
Yeah.
we need someone to like,
John's not going into too much detail because of the camera, but he's saying like, well, he knows where it all went. He knows where it is.
He knows where it is.
Yeah.
And we need a con artist to fight the con
on our
artist.
side. Yeah.
We need a con artist on our side.
Yeah. I mean, I heard all that. I didn't catch that. Of course.
Yeah. There's a whole story because John got Alan Klein, and then George and Ringo were convinced by John to go with Alan Klein, but Paul was like, no, I don't want to go with Alan Klein. Paul wanted to go with someone, I think in like Linda's brother or something.
Oh, because I heard somewhere today in one of the many videos I was watching that I think Mick Jagger or someone from the Rolling Stones specifically told Paul not to go with that guy.
Right. And so I don't know, who was right or who was wrong, but I think it points to Paul's psychology that he would be so smitten by someone.
John, you mean?
John would be so smitten by someone who
father
speaks.
Figure, maybe.
Yeah, or a father figure who's very grandiose. And the other thing you hear John say is, I think what John was indicating, and I don't know, I'm speculating, that Alan Klein might have, because, John was saying he knows us.
He knows us. He knows me. He knows you.
He knows you guys.
Yeah.
So you could see Alan Klein going like, I know the band. I know you're the leader. You're the smart one. And Paul's like the histrionic like doofbag. And like you can imagine Alan
John's
Klein
like, oh my God,
conning John and saying everything that John wants to hear, because Alan Klein's really good at tricking people.
And you would think John would be like street smart, but he's got this like kind of delicate ankle,
Right, exactly. The Achilles heel. Let's talk a little bit about gear. They always play the Fender Bass 6, which I really want now. I've always wanted one because of the Beatles, but
I didn't even understand what I was looking at. I'm like, is he playing a guitar? Why does it sound like a bass?
Right. I always thought it was a guitar until like 5 years ago.
But because like when they were playing some of the stuff, I'm like, okay, he's playing the bass, but what is that?
It's definitely, it's a bass. It's a 6-string bass and has a shorter neck, but longer than a guitar.
Yeah.
And it has different gauge strings on it naturally. And it absolutely sounds like a bass. And whenever John and George played the bass, they always played the Fender Bass 6, which I don't understand because
well, they couldn't play Paul's because they were left-handed.
Oh.
They had to play something
Or why
else.
don't they just get another bass in there?
I don't know, but yeah.
Well, okay, but I didn't think about that, but that would make sense. But
and you notice also, because remember, Paul sometimes would jerry-rig things, because like his Rickenbacker was like sort of odd because it was not really, I can't remember what he said, but it's like, well, such and such is in the wrong place because it's like not really left-handed.
Right. And it's funny how they had to fight with EMI to get an 8-track recorder.
Yeah. And then they're like, well, it's like Paul's like, I know they got one for the BG or for the Beach Boys.
For the Beach Boys, they're like, well, they're American. And the thing is that they still did not get an 8-track. They just got 2 4-tracks and daisy chained it. And then for some dumb reason they got George's 8-track to mix down to. Why not just record with George's 8-track?
I don't know. Maybe
the heads were in
quality.
The heads.
What I will say, and again, if you don't know what you're looking at, it goes over your head. But having done so much reading, and I've got the red book about all their recording stuff, and I looked into all the original equipment, all these things, and I was kind of drooling because even though it seems like they haphazardly assembled things together, like every one of those pieces of equipment was hand built.
Really?
Tubes,
like those microphones. Steel. Pretty much every vocal microphone I saw looked like a Radio Shack microphone.
Well, the problem with those mics, or not the problem. First of all, of course, they weren't Radio Shack, but the reason they were using those and not their usual Newman 67s is because they had to do it like so close to each other, and they didn't want the bleed.
They wanted dynamic,
right? But even those little mics, they're good mics. They're just...
They were?
Yeah.
They look like crap. And why was John and Paul singing into the side of
that one? I know, right?
I'm like, point it at your face.
But I don't know if it's that... I don't know if
it's
if
not
that
a
was
side
just like
register. That's a top register.
It was very weird.
I'm like, why? But then I saw John kind of futzing with the boom mic, and it was all kind of janky and loose, and he just sort of left it, and I'm like, that would give me so much agita, because when I have a microphone, especially if you're playing the piano, I want that thing to be secure. And John just kind of, and they're recording at this point, and John just kind of like flops the mic down, and I just felt like. And those other mics that they use on the rooftop were those like long, I don't know what you call them, but it comes with its own tripod essentially. Yeah. Are those good mics?
Well, they are, and here's why they're good. They're good. They're good live mics. No one can buy them because they were hand built for these people, right? And
because they have, when I look at them, like I said, they look like Radio Shack mics.
They're like EMI equipment or something, you know.
Oh, okay.
Now they on the instruments, they were using Neumann microphones, which these are original Neumann mics, which are the best you could do.
I think it's Neumann. German.
Neumann, sorry. And the console, like again, all of this hand built vacuum tubes. Awesome sounding,
right.
And they're going through like
and they're
smoking and Fairchilds.
They're smoking cigarettes and the ashes on the console.
And did you see how he put the cigarette on the string of the guitar?
Yeah. And they also put cigarettes on like the Fender Rhodes, and you would see burn marks on the side of the thing.
They're ruining it.
they're burning all their crap.
But
I'm like, get them a goddamn ashtray.
Right. Now they have amazing amps. Right, like at the time,
Fender Twin, they're not. I mean, they're classic guitar
now
amps.
People like drool if they can get one of those original Fender Twins, you know.
Yeah,
and at the time, it's just a Fender Twin.
But you and I could buy one that sounds very similar for $800.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at is that it's just that it's a good sounding amp, right? And they have professionals like. So there's a lot of things that go taken for granted. Like, why do they sound so good? Well, they're going through good equipment.
Well, they're also amazing musicians.
And they're amazing musicians.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. Like, one of the things that I heard recently from an engineer, because people were like, what microphone, I don't know how I got into this subreddit, but they're like, what microphone does, what's his face use? Oh,
Adele or something?
No, talk radio, Howard Stern.
Oh, Howard Stern.
They're like, what? Or maybe I was watching a YouTube clip and I was like, my God, his voice sounds amazing. What gear is that fucker using? Because the microphone looked like just like a regular, like, I don't know, like a Neumann or not Neumann.
No, an AKG, right? Like, isn't it?
Yeah. AKG, right. AKG.
AKG.
Yeah. Just a regular.
I'm pretty sure that's. And they run it through
it's like a mic like I'm using, like our mics, but maybe a more upper end.
Yeah.
But not like, it didn't look like it was $10,000. And I looked it up and I was like, what compressor are they using? And then people were commenting and they're like, I have that microphone and that doesn't sound that good. And they're like, it's because you don't have Howard Stern's voice.
No, absolutely.
Howard Stern.
You cannot discount that.
You put him through, a Shure 57 and he'll sound amazing because Howard Stern has an amazing voice.
There's no discounting that. In addition to that, like when they were recording at Abbey Road and at EMI and stuff, those were well-balanced rooms with experts that were so good at partitioning areas and not letting things bleed.
Which is like, in that room, I'm like, because they have monitors pointed at.
I don't know how they could do that.
Like, no one would ever record like this. You'd have headphones.
No, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But anyways, I guess what I was saying was that there was a lot of stuff that they didn't go into at all. That was like EMI was providing for free for them. Well, for free because it's the Beatles, and it's a lot. Even the fact that like their dude had created this whole custom recording setup, right? Yeah. And they go in there and they're like, it sounds like crap.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, fine. Throw that all out. Yeah. That must have cost a whole bunch of money. It doesn't matter.
But on the roof, they have, it's the wind and the crowd. Anyway, other observations. Oh, I think I knew this at one point, but I forgot. When they're on the roof, there's like a weird painting behind them that's like propped up. Did you notice that thing?
It looks like they're on the roof?
Yeah. There's like this. please, if anyone out there knows what I'm talking about, can you please email me? Because I'm so curious about this thing.
What that painting is?
There's it's like a multimedia art piece behind them that looks like a piece of junk, but I'm pretty sure it's a painting of some sort. I just want to...
Oh, by the way, even when they're on the roof, they were still being recorded by the same equipment downstairs.
Right.
Now I'll point out, like...
But still...
If you want to buy a console of that quality today, it's $100,000.
Sure. But if you and I had that equipment...
Yeah, we would not sound the same.
And we were outside on a roof in a January afternoon. You know what I mean? Like, it would sound like crap.
Yeah.
Linda McCartney was so pretty back then.
She was. And she was really... I felt like they had a very interesting relationship because there seemed to be a lot of love there. She was quiet. She didn't say almost anything.
I thought it was interesting how Mal and others would write the lyrics when they would sort of dictate the lyrics.
Yeah, I know. And actually...
and Mal would sometimes add his own words.
Add stuff, yeah. That's why I was saying, like, can I get a writing credit, Paul?
Yeah.
Oh, there was a moment where all the engineers and producers were jamming around, and I wrote a note. It's like, is this the start of the Alan Parsons project?
Right, exactly, Alan Parsons. Also, Paul's hair is amazing.
Oh my gosh, his beard and hair.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
I'm so geeky about it.
Yeah, I mean, because Paul's hair went through a lot of different phases over the years, and some of them very unfortunate in the 80s.
Yeah.
He had like a total mullet at one point. And
but this was peak Paul.
This is peak Paul hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is the most iconic because that's what I know from all those Let It Be videos and from the rooftop.
But the shot they have on the front of the Let It Be album, he looks like he has a helmet on his head.
I guess so, but when you see the videos of him playing, yeah.
And he was in love with his hair. He kept playing with it all the time.
And his beard too, which I've had a beard before, and I definitely do that.
Yeah. Also, a little thing about Paul is that he's even better on piano than I knew him to be from this footage. I was like...
I knew he was really good because his dad played piano.
Yeah.
He learned to play piano young and would entertain the whole family playing piano, all sorts of tunes. So I had a pretty... And plus, he learned piano songs at the same time as he was learning guitar songs.
But it's, he sits down and he plays Martha, My Dear, and it's virtuosic.
Yeah,
you're just like... Oh my God.
Yeah, because it's not just the right...
I could just listen to him play piano.
Yeah, first of all, he's playing on an amazing piano, but also his touch is really nice.
Have you ever seen another Bluthner in your life?
No.
There's because all the videos, there's this that big white Bluthner on the side of that piano, and I was
but
like,
it's a really nice, and it's amazing that even when they make it sound crappy, it sounds awesome.
Yeah, I don't think they made it sound crappy.
Well, with the newspapers, remember?
Yeah,
but they're trying to make it sound all like ratty.
Well, I think that was George Martin's like compromise because I think what George was asking was because a honky tonk piano is detuned.
Yeah.
And I think George Martin was like, I'm not going to detune that thing. Like that thing.
We're just going to make it sound a little muty.
Yeah, a little. Yeah. And Paul was worse on the drums than I thought. Like when he was playing,
but he was just screwing around.
But I don't. But he didn't. When he sat down on the drums, I was like, oh, okay, let's because I don't, especially back then, have any footage of him playing. Of course, on a track.
But I mean, when you hear "Why Don't We Do It on the Road," he's playing the drums. It's not an amazing drum part.
No, it's fine.
It's serviceable.
Yeah. And he plays in the beginning of. Is it Julia? He plays in the beginning. And then Ringo takes over at the end. Anyway, yeah, I mean, but when he was just kind of messing around on the drums, it sounded bad.
I feel like
it sounded like a bad drummer messing around. It didn't sound like a good drummer messing around the piano.
From my experience, drums is the one instrument, not the one instrument, that's not true. It's just drums is an instrument that you can't just translate into just because you understand piano and guitar.
Totally. I've been to that building where they do the...
No.
Yeah, you know what it is?
Tottenham? No, the rooftop building.
Yeah, well, where the, it's the basement, the whole... That used to be...
Oh, man.
You know what it is now?
No.
It's a Gap Kids.
What?
Yeah.
You can't even tour it or anything?
No, well, you can go in.
Can you go to the roof?
It's a multi-stored...
Yeah.
It's a multi-storied
That's
Gap.
annoying, dude.
But there's a lot of Beatles stuff inside because they know that people... But you can't go up to the roof.
Oh, man. That's sad. You should have gone in there and like, you guys are disturbing the peace.
I know. It's just funny. It's a gap.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it would have been so much better if it was like a law office or something. It's just like, it's a gap, kids, blah. I thought it was funny how they kept stalling the cops.
Okay, that was hilarious. And at the same time, I felt so bad for the cops because they're just doing their job.
Yeah.
You know, they're like, and they feel so helpless. They're like,
well, so I thought in my head, because I've seen the other cuts that they do,
Yeah.
that the cops, in reality, because they actually showed it true to time,
yeah.
the cops showed up almost immediately.
Well, and in the, if this is what you're getting at, because like my memory from having seen the Let It Be thing was, I was like, oh, the cops showed up and stopped it.
Right.
That was my memory.
Right, but what happens is the cops show up and they mess around with them for what seems to be like 45 minutes.
And in the end, they actually didn't stop it.
Yeah, they just sort of, they just ended on their own, and the cops said, okay, good.
Okay, good.
And
like it's not like they had more songs to play.
Right. And then the sergeant shows up and he looks like a serious dude.
And I was scared because when he shows up, I'm thinking, oh no, this is probably when they finally shut it down.
But then he's like, he goes,
Can I go upstairs?
Hello, is it okay if I go upstairs?
I know.
You know,
I know.
And he's like so
I know.
polite.
I'm glad you and I had the same experience because he looks like that role in a movie. That's who you cast as the rough and tumble sergeant.
Yeah, he looked like he was about like to say like, no, we're shutting it down.
And he's like, how many cops are here?
Yeah.
Oh, can I go on the roof?
Yeah, is it okay?
Is it okay?
Is it okay?
It's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. You know, he's
Look,
like
there's a
being
lot of people.
super nice. Are they upstairs? Okay, go and they're like, well, we don't want you to go upstairs because they're recording. He's like, oh, okay, well, you know. The other
also sorry, go ahead.
The other interesting thing about that I learned was that Billy Preston was extremely ad hocly added.
Okay, so that another one of my notes was like how amazing serendipitous thing that was, where they were discussing him. First of all, they met him in Hamburg.
Yeah.
Now, to you and I, when we hear that, that's like, oh my gosh, they knew Billy from the old Middle Ages of England.
Yeah.
But to them, it's just a few years ago.
Well, 8 years ago.
But it's just a few years ago. Like, imagine you and I met someone in Vancouver 8 years ago. And we're like, dude, that's the guy we met in Vancouver.
Right.
It's nothing.
Right.
And so they're like, yeah, Billy Preston. We saw him in Hamburg. Okay. He happened to be coming. He shows up to say hi.
So they mention him.
Right.
And they're like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a piano player?
Someone.
They go Billy Preston. And they mentioned someone
the Rolling
else.
Stones one.
And then one day Billy Preston just walks in the door.
He had another thing going on.
He's just in town.
And John casually says, like, yeah, you should sit down, play with us.
And then they play,
and it's
awesome,
magic.
Yeah, and I'm getting chills thinking about it, especially on "Don't Let Me Down." Don't let me down.
It's so beautiful.
Don't let me down. Yeah, it's just like perfect. Yeah,
and he, I mean, first of all, what a virtuoso.
Instead of "Don't let me down." Yeah,
what a virtuoso. Right? Like,
yeah.
That guy could play anything endlessly. Because what chart music did they give him?
Yeah.
How much prep did he have?
Yeah, it was so good.
He sits in and he's like, what's the... Oh, okay. Blim, 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 blim.
Yeah.
And so some of the iconic things we know in all these songs are his little licks.
Right.
Oh.
And then the next day, he doesn't come because, you know, they were just kind of messing around. And they're like... I wonder if we should like have an arrangement with him. Is he coming back? I don't know.
We should pay him.
Yeah, I don't know if we can pay him. Do we have money?
He's like, we should have him in the band.
And then he comes another day and they're like, this is great. And you know, I think Paul turns to him and he's just like, is it okay that, you know, that we're doing this? Or do you have other things to do?
I've got nothing else to do.
And he becomes another, you know.
Well, I remember John, the day you were mentioning, John's like, I wouldn't mind him in the band. We should have a fifth Beatle.
Yeah.
Which imagine how that would be.
That's what I'm saying. Like, if only George and John just did their own albums, which would have been great. They could have had All Things Must Pass and
imagine
what was John's first? Imagine it was that his first
progressive
album?
that the Beatles' fifth member is not Eddie Murphy.
Yeah.
It's freaking Billy Preston.
Yeah, and so that was amazing. Then the other element of the story that was new to me was, you know, in other interviews they always say like, yeah, everything was falling apart. and then Billy Preston shows up, and everything changed. But you clearly see that everything was changing before Billy Preston showed up anyway.
Yeah.
Like, they probably would have been fine without Billy Preston.
Yeah, I think no question that the second meeting or whatever with George, they reached some compromise. But as we were saying earlier, John finally showing up to play had a huge impact.
Yeah, and I think George clearly made a choice of, all right,
I'll go along with this.
I'm not going to be a baby.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to, because he immediately shows back up and is just like, yeah, let's do this thing.
And Paul seemed to tone down somewhat.
Yeah,
So.
but you could imagine Paul toning down because George wasn't like poo-pooing everything, you know?
Yeah.
So.
But, oh man, I'm sitting there, like, I was in awe of when it was all coming together, because really, you're sitting there, it's 1 minute they're noodling, they're goofing around, and then for a second it all comes together. And you're like, God, that sounds so good.
Yeah.
These people are so good at what they do. And it made me realize, like, the magic that, we've talked about this before, the magic that happens in a room with people playing together is, it's beautiful.
Totally. And, I don't know where the next phase of my musical career takes me, but I do really miss that, of having musicians that are masters of their instrument that will, figure out a part to my songs, and make it and elevate it to a whole other thing, but it takes so much time, as you can tell from this movie, And the last detail I'll say is that George talks about having Dylan in the band. They're talking about getting other people
We
in the
should
band.
get Bob Dylan.
And then, of course, Traveling Wilburys.
Traveling Wilburys, super band.
All right, let's rank the songs and let's get out of here.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. One last little detail. Remember when Paul looks back and he sees the cops and he goes, woo! Like, there's this little awesome moment where he's sitting there playing. He looks back and he sees the cops and he turns back and he goes, woo!
Yeah.
Like, uh-oh, we're in trouble now.
Also, when he says, thanks, Mout, like, I never knew what he said. Do you know what he means by that?
When he says what?
At the very end, Paul is like, it's even on the album. He goes, thanks, Mout. John says,
on behalf of the group, I'd like to thank you all. I hope we passed the audition.
And then Paul says, thanks, Mout.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Okay.
Well, he's saying thanks to Ringo's wife, Maureen. I think her name's Maureen.
Oh, because she handed it.
Well, because she starts to scream. She goes.
Oh,
she goes.
I
Yay!
I see.
And
okay.
Paul kind of looks at her and he's like, "Thanks, Mo. Like,
okay.
Thanks for cheering for us."
Okay, I didn't catch that and know that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
all right, ranking songs.
Yeah. So give me your worst to best list here.
All right.
And I'll chime in if.
All right.
I'll chime in whenever you name one. I'll tell you where I put it.
Okay. First of all, it's not on the actual album, but I am gonna say I think you were slagging a little bit, but "Don't Let Me Down" is a song I really like.
So "Don't Let Me Down," where does it show up?
It's a single.
Oh.
It's a B-side in something.
Because I always thought it was on this album.
In fact, it might be the B-side to "Get Back." It might be.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely putting that on in this ranking.
So I didn't rank it, but if I ranked it, it'd be like in my top 6 or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, 12 for me.
So let's talk about that. So
okay.
"Don't Let Me Down," I put number 4.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know why I didn't know it was on this album, but anyway.
So why were you? It was sounding like you didn't like it as much.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I don't like. I mean, when
you're saying in general, the songs in this album are not.
Yeah, I mean, so it's 4th best on this album, but like,
I actually really like "Don't Get Me Down." But wait, what?
Don't let me down.
Don't get me down.
Yeah, because I like if I was to put in a song, Beatles playlist of 30 songs, like this definitely wouldn't be in it.
I guess the reason I like it so much is just because of that performance and their harmonies, and they sound so good doing it.
Yeah.
Maybe as a song by itself, like if someone did that song, maybe I wouldn't be as impressed. But they themselves, and with that organ, it sounds really good.
Yeah, it does, especially as you hear the iterations building up to it. But yeah, it's not one of my favorites.
But my number 12 is "One After 909."
Yeah, I have that at 11.
Okay, and the reason
it's a great rocker.
It's a great rocker. It's in a style that if that song had been in one of their early albums, I would have been okay with.
Right. At
this point in their career, because I never actually loved that style to begin with. Now I'm like, yeah, I don't care.
They were too floppy to make that sound the way that they would have back in the day, I think.
Because a modern this is going to sound weird, but like a modern song that they did that I really enjoy, but that has elements of that stuff is the Ballad of John and Yoko. But that song's evolved, and I think it's got a lot of soul to it. This song is just a rocker, and it's kind of meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, right. It's a great song, and honestly, if I were to put a song on this album, that might be one of them. But in terms of like its importance,
it is fun. It's a fun song.
Yeah, but in terms of its importance in my life, number 11.
And keep in mind, all of these songs would rank miles ahead of my least favorite song.
Every Oasis song.
Well, I'm not gonna go there, but there's a lot of bands I don't like. Okay.
Every Coldplay song.
You're pissing me off. All right. Number 11 for me is Maggie May.
Yeah, I had that 12.
Oh, dirty Maggie.
I mean, it's arguably not a Beatles song. It's a traditional song. So.
Yeah. And it's a fun little ditty, but yeah.
And it's one of the thousands of goofball tangents that annoyed me in this whole thing. I'm like, will you please stop playing some old, Chuck Berry song terribly, by the way, and work on your goddamn music.
And I agree. At the same time, I think the reason they include it in the album is probably the reason I like it, is that there's something charming about it.
Yeah.
And it's just John's charm. It's all it is.
And they're harmonizing well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then number 10 for me. Oh, wait, what was your number 11?
One After 99.
Oh,
my 13 is Dig It.
Oh, you did 13 because of Don't Let Me Down. So Dig It was your 13.
Yeah.
Your 12 was
Maggie May.
And then 11 was One After 99. Yeah. So Dig It, I put number 10. The reason I like Dig It better is because it sort of like opens up this little window into a fun moment. Yeah. And it's like, like the Rolling Stone, dun, 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 and they're just jamming. So for me, it's like, I don't know, there's something about it that it's like me getting to look into a jam session. And because it starts in the middle of it, it's just right. And it was awesome in the documentary seeing they're jamming, and I'm thinking this sounds a little like the Dig It.
Yeah,
jam.
that was nice to see. Like, oh, that's where they excised that bit.
And they say this part of this appears in the. By the way, that was awesome in the documentary. Every time they said this take is the one that appears on the.
Right.
I was like, oh my god.
Yeah.
Number nine for me is I Me Mine.
Oh really?
I struggled a lot. I think it's great.
I put that one number 5.
I think I Me Mine is great. Now, look, first of all, number 9 amongst other songs, like, it's a great song.
Yeah.
All through the day.
I think it's a beautiful
I Me
song.
Mine. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'll explain why I ranked his other one higher, but when I get to it. But for me, this one, it wasn't that it is not good. It's just that I just happen to like the other ones more.
Okay.
So it's a taste thing. It's just
I kind of like this song more because of hearing how it was developed, because I almost feel like the recording doesn't do it justice.
I could see that.
Because when he's just playing it by himself and he's showing it to the rest of the band, I'm like, that song, if you recorded it like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, because it kind of has that similar vibe, that could have been an amazing tune.
Part of the thing that ranks it down for me a little bit, and I think this is maybe where you're going with it, is that the chorus I'm not as crazy about. So like the verses are beautiful and intriguing. And then the chorus is
mine.
Fine.
Yeah, it's arguably a bridge, honestly.
Yeah. Me, mine. It's fine.
Yeah, but you could see how George developed that in response to all their bluesy jams,
Now, I have a funny story about this. Last night, I was sitting there, and I'm like, I was listening to the beginning of I Me Mine, which starts with boom, the guitar. And I'm like, wait, where have I heard this before? And I kept playing it, and I'm like, and in my head, I was hearing like a version of that was a different song.
Like a Kanye song or something?
And I'm thinking, wait. Am I imagining things? And it started getting sort of surreal. I'm like, maybe I'm having like an aneurysm. I don't even. And I kept but I kept going with it, and I would sing it to myself and try to vary it. And I was finally giving up, and I was sort of like feeling depressed. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, it's an Elton John song. And I went back, and I was like trying to figure out which one is it. And it's in his album Empty Sky, I think it's called. And the song is called Lady Samantha. And it starts with tam, and then like a similar kind of chord, and then a guitar going damn, like very similar. And that's why it actually, when you hear them side by side, you're like, oh, there's a similarity there.
Yeah, Elton John, I think, outwardly worshipped the Beatles.
Well, this came out in January of '69.
Oh.
Yeah, so I was wondering, and I don't think so because it's not that close. But when that was the first thought I had.
The song came out.
Yeah.
So they copied it kind of.
Well, the first thought I had when the same thing you just said, I was like, I wonder if Elton was like so into. But then I looked at the date and I'm like, wait, this came out in January of '69.
Would Elton have been even on their radar at that point?
Yeah, he's British, and that's a small scene, right? Like it's a tight knit group in London. But that said, when you listen to the song and you listen to the intro, I don't know that connection is evident. It's just that I know that song so well that for me the connection was there.
Yeah.
I'll play it for you later and you'll see. But anyways, what was your number 9?
My number 9, well, my number 10, I'm one behind you, was For You Blue. I'm guessing that's your other song that you put up higher.
Yep.
I've just never really liked that song. I think John's slide is goofy, and it's a blues song, and I thought it was interesting that John said, he's like, oh my God, that's my favorite. John says that about that song, and I'm like, why? Like, it's such a boring blues. Like, it's fine. It's a 12-bar blues song. It's not terrible. But
no, I can totally understand what you're saying. I'll explain my reasoning in a minute, but I would never fight someone on this one. Like,
well, tell me now.
Okay, so I actually put it as number 5.
Okay.
I've always.
That's funny because we have "I Me Mine" For You Blue. Like,
I've always liked this song before this documentary, and this
I
documentary.
Love you more than ever, girl.
This documentary made me appreciate it even more.
It's got a beautiful. All of George's lines are, I would say, honestly, given his solo work, I would say peak George is like 67 to 71.
Yeah.
Like his chords and his song structure and his melodies are they're killer.
Very interesting. Yeah. And so this song, even though, because I guess that's part of it, it's just a freaking blues song.
Yeah.
What you don't like about the slide guitar, to me, makes it sound haunting.
Yeah.
Like there's this weird rubber bandy thing, like an old radiola or something, like, and the groove is cool. It's almost ahead of its time in a way, like, and the lyrics are fine. I don't look too much into it, but it's pretty. It's a pretty melody.
Yeah.
So anyways.
So my number 9 is I've Got a Feeling. I've got a feeling,
it's a great
feeling deep inside. But it's not my favorite. And this documentary, I think, made it worse for me, honestly.
Oh, really?
Because just hearing it so many times, because there's some songs where they played, like Get Back, I've Got a Feeling, Don't Let Me Down. There's some songs where they played and made us watch over and over again.
Well, and this is one, because Paul's part ends up going so high, it's one that he couldn't blurt out the whole time.
Yeah.
So it's the one rare occasion where you actually don't hear him sounding great sometimes when he's rehearsing it.
Like, it's a similar song to Oh Darling, Sure. It seems like he wrote it at the same time. Yeah. And Oh Darling is such a better song. Like,
and he can't sit there singing those kinds of songs all day long.
Right. But like, I've got a feeling deep inside. Oh yeah. It just seems to repeat itself. It doesn't have it's almost like he had a great idea and couldn't follow through.
I agree. I put it as 7. I put it slightly higher than you. The thing I really like about it is it creates kind of this foundational, almost drone.
Right. It seems like that was kind of all of their, well, maybe particularly Paul. Like, I think Paul was getting into like drone stuff.
And I really like that, right? And it's the Indian influence maybe, but I really like that. Now, so on the one hand, I don't love what happens chord and almost structure-wise with the chorus. Like, it gets a little too rockabilly or something. However, what saves it for me is Paul's voice when in the actual performance is like intimidating.
Right.
It's like
the rooftop performance that they use has great energy to it.
And he just nails it. And so that's why. But it's still only a number 7 for me.
And it's kind of a risk. Like there's a few parts where you're just like, that's weird. Like, I don't go to
and nobody told me.
Yeah. And then George, like, it's such a weird arrangement, but it works.
Yeah. So then my number 8 is Get Back.
Okay, that's my number 6.
Okay. Now, I struggled because I really like Get Back. In fact, I'd say it's one of the songs that I want to hear on a somewhat regular basis.
I think when I was a kid, it would have been up there, but in my Beatles mania years, it was never like a go-to song for me. It's fine. It's great.
Yeah.
But I'm not like dying. I'm not dying to hear it.
I think I realized through this that I don't like it as much as I thought I did.
It's a great jam, though.
It's a great jam.
Like when he starts noodling, you're just like, it's a great song.
Yeah. Bam, bam. It's awesome.
Yeah. So no. Go ahead. What's your number 8?
That was my number.
What's
8.
Number 7?
Number 7 for me is I Got a Feeling. So
okay. My number 8 is Dig a Pony.
Yeah.
All I want is you. I kind of like that line. It's sort of Led Zeppelin-y to me. But in terms of a song, I dig a pony. Like, I don't know. It's just it's a pretty mediocre Beatles song in my book.
I put it as number 6 because I really like John in this. I don't know if I get what he's saying. I don't know if he gets what he's saying, but I get it in a weird way. Like, I dig a pony.
Well, originally it was called All I Want Is You,
yeah.
which he's singing to Yoko, which I totally, and I kind of like, there's a few moments, and watching them perform it in this documentary makes me appreciate some moments of that song. But anyway.
When I thought the symbolism that I totally made up, but it was like, he's saying like I like something, and tastes are what they are. And so like, he's sort of like almost justifying his like and love of Yoko. But whatever the case may be, musically, it's very interesting. And this is one of the songs that when I was really listening to, I'm like, this is such a departure for them.
Right.
Very interesting.
This is what you were talking about earlier. It's like, it's like nothing they've done before, or not like anything that you've heard from other bands. It was a weird confluence of their complicated songwriting structure and bluesy stuff that they're trying to kind of integrate. My number 7?
6.
My number 7 is Long and Winding Road. I'm guessing you have it higher.
I do.
I like this song. Definitely, it's in the top half of my ranking here. But of the top half, it's not my favorite. and I don't think I ever really, of Paul's piano songs, considered this like, I bet you of Paul piano songs, this is definitely in the lower half. It's a great song for sure. And if this was the only song I'd ever heard by the Beatles, I'd be like, that's an amazing song. But when I think about
just ranking with everything.
Yeah. So what's your number? What are you on?
I did.
Where'd you put Long and Winding?
Oh, okay. The Long and Winding Road for me is number 4. I really do love this song. I remember listening to it over and over in college, and there was something longing about it. It's so. Yeah. I could picture it. I could picture a long and winding road.
Yeah, it's a rare Paul song that, not a rare, but one of those Paul songs where the lyrics don't cheese me out.
Right, and you could visualize something. By the way,
and remember, he's 26 when he writes this song. The long and winding road to the age of 26.
Everyone, including Paul, complains about the Phil Spector arrangement.
Yeah, like, I don't understand why.
He cheesified it. He added all the strings. I love it. Not only
I think
that,
it's fine.
I went back. Here's my gripe of wrath for the day.
I think so. So here's what I think happened. This is my speculation. So if you don't know, and you're still listening, if you're not a Beatles fan, you're still listening 3.5 hours into this.
Like, wow.
But I think that the album kind of sucked, particularly in comparison to other Beatles albums. And I think they needed a scapegoat, and they scapegoated Phil Spector. Because I think the Phil Spector mixes, although you could argue diminish a little bit and aren't to your liking, but given what he was working with, these were especially when you watch the documentary, you're just like, my God, they basically just jammed for a few days and then just pieced out of the studio. Like they didn't go back in and clean up. They didn't do the work to re-record or anything. And so like I've never thought that the Phil Spector mixes were terrible.
No, I never did. Not only that, before I knew any of that drama, I liked this album. It wasn't my favorite of theirs, but I liked it. And part of it is that when you listen to songs over and over and over, every little detail starts mattering, and you can tell when it's not right. As an example, there's versions of songs out there, like Bob Dylan songs or other songs, where there's different versions. And I always know immediately. One famous one is Carpenter's Top of the World. There's like 3 different versions of their song.
Totally.
I grew up with one specific version.
Yeah.
And when the other ones start playing, I'm like, that's not the right one.
Right.
Turn that abomination
Yeah, well, when
off.
we were watching Get Back, the documentary, I was like, oh, is this the album track? And then Paul would do a little variation.
No, that's not it.
So we're not listening to the real track.
So here's my gripe of rap. I don't know if you heard that a couple of years ago, they put out this thing called Let It Be Naked.
Yeah.
And I listened to it. And
people are like, oh my God, so much better. Yeah.
I hate it. Hate it with a passion. Number one, they took out all the strings on Long and Winding Road. Well, guess what? Some of the melodies that I remember are string parts.
Right.
Number one. Number two.
I mean, arguably their riffs on the piano part. The string part is basically matching kind of what Paul's playing.
But like the da 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 da.
Oh, right.
That's gone.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why can't I hum that if it's not important? Okay.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I listened to 3 or 4 of them. I didn't listen to the whole album because I was so incensed. What I'll say is that Paul approved it. And this to me was the Lucasification of the past. It was George Lucas saying, I didn't like what I did with Star Wars, so I'm going to go back in and add puppets, right? Now, this was the opposite, was I'm going to take all the puppets away, take all the effects away. I actually thought that Star Wars shouldn't have spaceships and shouldn't have any lasers. So I took all the special effects away.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you listen to the naked versions, I don't think you're like saying, oh my God, what an amazing, I now can hear the beauty of it. No, it's a different version, different mix, if you will. And it's naked. It's like extremely empty sounding.
And they did something that ruined one. So in Let It Be, the last time he sings the verse, when it's like, and in my hour of darkness, she is standing right. In the very last verse, he doesn't play the normal A minor. He briefly plays like a B, E, D or something over the A, and then corrects it. And no one has ever been able to confirm whether it was like a purposeful kind of riff or a mistake. But it sounds amazing, and it makes that moment so intense. And they picked a different take that doesn't have that at all. And Paul approved it. So, gripe for rap. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I've got.
Well, I'm glad we agree about that because like it's such a hipstery thing to say, like, oh, the naked is so much better. It's fine if you like the naked.
GTFO.
Great, it's great, but it's not objectively better.
Yeah. So my number 6 was Dig a Pony.
Yeah, we already talked about that.
Yeah. My number 5. Oh, what did you say? Your number 6 already?
Is Get Back.
Oh, Get Back is your number 6. Okay. Yeah. My number 5 is For You Blue. So I put it up there. I talked about it already. It's fine. And then my number 4 was Long and Winding Road. What are your number?
Oh, we've already talked about mine. So give me your number 3.
My number 3 is Across the Universe.
Oh, that's my number 2.
I figured you have it high. It's an amazing song.
Yeah, and I wish there was more jamming of that song, but of course there wouldn't be because the version we get is John by himself.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they jam with the band, and it doesn't sound quite right. And then the version we get on the album is John just by himself,
just doing it.
Right?
I don't know. I didn't know that.
Or maybe with Paul harmonizing a little bit.
Like I said, I've forgotten more about the Beatles.
There's no drums, there's no like they tried to make it into a rock 4-piece song, and
it is a very pretty, beautiful lyrics, and
I mean, if there was a song, there's a handful of songs that I would send to an alien planet as a representation of our culture, and this would be one of them.
So I have a feeling I know what your number 3 is.
Which is
my number 2.
2 of Us.
2 of Us.
Yeah.
2 of Us is is the encapsulation of their relationship.
Yeah.
It's an amazing...
They write it together.
Oh, yes.
They work on it together.
And it's beautiful. It's objectively... Now we're talking about one of my favorite Beatles songs.
Yeah.
Now it's no longer just like one of the better ones in this album.
No, yeah.
One of my favorite Beatles songs.
And then, of course, number one, Let It Be.
And number one is Let It Be, which is not only the number one in this album, is my favorite Beatles song, the first one I ever learned.
Yeah. And it's pretty easy to play on piano, and a beautiful song. And I noticed while he was playing it that I don't play it right. And maybe you play it right, I don't know, but I play a really simplified version of, because he does these little things with his left hand that I'm like, he does something with his left thumb that I'm like, what are you doing with your left thumb?
So I've gone through 3 phases. Phase 1 in college, I played it probably the way you play it, pretty straightforward, right? Then I took a time years ago, maybe when you and I were, maybe in 2008 or something, where I sat there and listened so closely, and I learned all these little details, and I looked online.
You played the B.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Oh no, that's a long
and
way.
then years went by, and I forgot almost everything, and so then now I play it back to the normal version.
Yeah. But yeah, Two of Us is also an added level of I don't know, appreciation for me, is that I played in a duo with Danny.
You guys played that one, right?
Yeah, and it might have been the very first song we even practiced together, because we're both mega Beatles fans, and it's a harmonizing song, pretty easy to play, and it's always been one of my favorites. And we could sit there with 2 acoustic guitars and play it, and it might have even been one of the first songs we played live. But yeah, I used to, this guy named Danny, friend of mine, and we would play on the streets. We would play Pike Place Market, and we learned how to busk, how to play with 2 acoustic guitars. And he's an amazing singer and guitarist. And I don't know, it was just a really fun kind of chapter in my musical career.
So it's interesting that in the early Beatles albums, the songs were simple, but they were complete beginning to end, full verses, full choruses, usually a middle eight, stuff like that. And Martin would add the additional sprinkle of production, and so they sounded complete.
Yeah.
Then in the middle career, they took all the craft time to get the songs perfect.
Yeah.
Not only perfect playing, like just the arrangements, all the details, everything. And then by this album, these are not fully complete songs. Well, Let It Be is, but like some of them are not fully complete.
Yeah.
And yet that is part of their charm. It's kind of a window in time of their...
Yeah, and this song, along with maybe a couple other songs, you really appreciate another skill that we haven't mentioned, is the Beatles' ability to change the song arrangement midstream.
Yeah.
To hear the early versions of Two of Us, and you're like, well, it's not terrible, but and in my head, I started kind of forgetting what the real version is, and then by the end of the thing, when they play the real, you're like, oh my god, yes, this, like, how they got there eventually, you know. And you hear them kind of randomly getting there, where Paul's like, well, what if we just played acoustic, you know? And George is like, you could hear George like, shit, if we have three guitars,
what do I do?
Yeah, I think George literally says like, well, what do I do? And George is like, or Paul's like, well, you know, and
Paul's a good guitarist, so he immediately starts adding little licks and stuff.
Right. Immediately he adds that like, and you're like, he just randomly came up with that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say, just a side note about George's part, I've never liked his part in that song.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's just, it sounds too, I don't know, loose or something. And I get what he's trying to do with that. And it was interesting to hear George. I think he was going through a phase where he liked that style of riff.
I guess so.
Like really kind of run it.
Yeah.
Like it's even in like this, that kind of full step up slide thing.
Well, you get that idea that, like, you know, George is someone that just learned covers to start with. Then he's learning sort of the parts for his friends' songs that are in the same vein. He never like went to school. He didn't do like the official learning. And now he's being exposed to other guitarists who are studio musicians and like very theory oriented, all these things. So he's picking up little tricks and little tidbits, and he's trying to apply them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I always wondered about George's part, because you could sort of hear it in the background, and I always was like, what's going on back there? I'm pretty sure that's George, you know? Yeah. And I mean, what do you think of his guitar part in that song?
Well, unfortunately, I don't listen to guitar as much as I do bass, piano, vocal.
Well, there's no bass in that song.
No, I'm saying in general, like when I hear a song,
yeah,
like it's
definitely mixed into the background.
Well, and so it used to be worse. Like when, this is part of what was so hard for me to write guitar parts, is that I would realize that I might have never paid attention to the guitar part in a song that I loved.
Yeah.
And then I would listen to it. I'm like, oh, that's weird. I've never heard that, you know? Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I don't know. I don't catch that part.
Oh, well, it's not a great part.
You know what I will say? This maybe my final thought about this whole thing was that there's a lot of Beatles doubters out there that are like, you know, were they really good musicians? All these things. And
what? Well, I don't think anyone says that.
No, a lot of people do, because objectively speaking, none of them were musically officially trained, right? So like if you're talking about like, well, compared to...
You and I aren't musically trained.
What I mean is, like when you compare them to like virtuoso guitarists and virtuoso drummers and all these things, the Neil Pearts and the Eric Claptons, or Eric, the other great, Yngwie Malmsteen, all these guys, like, of course, there's no comparison. None of them, even Paul, can hold a candle to virtuoso players on those instruments.
Well, like in terms of speed, is that what you're talking about?
In terms of like ability to play those instruments to a high level, blah, 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 blah.
Well, I'm arguing with the people that you're arguing with.
But it's not, I mean, you can look it up. It's not an uncommon sentiment that the Beatles weren't that great of musical players, is what I'm saying, right? Now, however, number one, these guys grew up playing live in constant live venues where they were entertaining as F.
Yeah.
Like, they would blow the minds of their audiences. It wasn't just, look, objectively, these guys aren't like Adonises. Yeah, Paul's kind of cute, but that's not why they were blowing the minds of everyone.
Right.
They were so entertaining.
Yeah, and when, you know, they set their mind, particularly to their vocals, they could deliver some, especially John and Paul, some of the best vocal performances you could ever hear. Yeah.
So yes, John,
the soul, and the style, you know, like that was actually one thing about this documentary that gave me a new appreciation for John during this time, was just how soulful and melodic some of his lines were. You know, you're just wow, that's like a beautiful line.
So sure, he'll sound a little rough around the edges when he's just like goofing around.
But when he really puts his effort into it.
Oh, dude.
Yeah.
And they're sitting there playing these songs live on a rooftop. And not only are they sounding amazing, they're sounding so good that that's the version that ends up going on the album that they put out to the world.
Yeah.
And this is over a period of a couple of weeks with tons of dysfunction in the middle, which just proves these guys were amazing players. And I mean players in the sense that they could lock in, they could pick up things quickly, they could sound like glue so well. The fact that, you know how it is, when you get 5 musicians in a room and it's like, hey, let's just start playing, and it sounds good somehow.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
When Billy Preston joins in, he could have stood out as a sore thumb because these other musicians are shown to be not that. No, that's not what happens. You can tell Billy's got a lot of licks, but they gel and they sound amazing together.
Yeah.
So anyways, I just leave this going, proving what I already knew, which is, man, yeah, Paul is a music savant, but this band was awesome. And I would have given anything. Imagine seeing them live at like the Cavern or in one of those early, really energetic shows, you know?
Yeah.
Or seeing the rooftop concert.
Well, I thought this episode would take maybe an hour and a half, but it's almost 4 hours, Berto.
It took almost as long as the documentary.
All right, everyone out there, all you need is love, and take care of yourself because
you deserve it.